Hi, this is Krishna Iyer with the Iyer think tank in Delray Beach. I'm glad you could join us today. This podcast is, again, the final pages of Thought Control in Democratic Societies. It's Necessary Illusions is the name of the book by Noam Chomsky. And so, in the last presentation, we got into some of the information with respect to the American, totalitarian media. American media is a totalitarian media. It is an authoritarian media similar to Hitler's media of Nazi Germany and Stalin's media of Russia. It is a media that is, quote unquote, pretend democracy in the sense that, there is, the pretense of democracy, but it all just a pretense. It fizzles away when you actually studied it at length. You'll see that all of the pretense of democracy fizzles away and it turns into a fascist media of totalitarianism. The structure of the media is that the capitalist elite, the business elite, report to some central organization, the United States Congress, that tells them what to promote or what the news should be. That news is transmitted by Congress to the different news outlets, the New York Times, Washington Post. It is basically a deception and thought control type of media. It's all lies. The capitalist elite give all lies. It's a conservative group that are interested only in their own personal well-being and their own personal interests. They care nothing of the masses or, the actual interest in improving conditions for working people or for anyone at all. It is a, group of deceitful liars, propagandists. And, that is where, it breaks down. It breaks down into a poor mode of thought control, trying to indoctrinate people into an ideology. The Sandinistas are bad. El Salvador's Duarte is good. All of these things are, meant to create a thought control situation in which the people that they want to, promote their money and their cash and their racist oppression and racist subjugation in the third world is, given credence. And the ones that are trying to improve the conditions for their own people and, pushing America away, pushing the sphere of American influence away because they see America as a danger to their people, end up being, antagonized and attacked by the U.S. government. Like we said, it is a racist group of, American terrorists. America is a terrorist state and the U.S. Congress are white terrorists. That is our statement. That is what we are going. We discussed El Salvador, Indochina, Nicaragua, and Brazil, and we will finish the book at this point. We're starting on chapter 86. The U.S. government declared the PNC Declaration, that is the PNC Declaration with respect to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242 and 338. The crowning achievement was, of course, dismissed. Turning to matters that Washington was willing to take seriously, first, the PNC acceptance of UN 242 was too ambiguous because it was accompanied by a call for recognition of the rights of the Palestinians alongside with those of Israel, and therefore failed to meet the demands of the U.S.-Israeli rejectionism, in which the two countries are largely isolated. Second, the PNC did not meet the U.S. conditions on renunciation of terror. That is, the PNC adopted the position of the international community, which the United States and Israel alone reject. So that is the end of that particular section on the PNC resolution. Now let us just give you some background on this presentation. Like I said, Noam Chomsky's book is on my description section. Please download the PDF at the above link. It will be available and it will be, easily used. We have discussed the concepts of United States propaganda, falsification, deceitful media, and fascist authoritarianism. The concepts of colonialism and the goal of the American media is to hide the criminal terrorist actions of the U.S. government in their colonial ambitions, including their programs in Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia. The effectiveness of the American media is absolute. It completely removes the humanitarian and racist, murderous brutality against third world people, and replaces it with a tirade of propaganda against an innocent group of leaders who are deemed as quote unquote communists, authoritarians, or murderers, or as not effective business people to be manipulated by the US capitalist elite. For this reason, it is very important to understand the underlying motives of US media, mainly their colonial ambitions, to maintain a state of racist subjugation and promote slavery and complete control of its fascist client states. We reviewed the next two chapters of Dr. Chomsky's book, Bounds of the Expressible and Adjuncts of Government. In Bounds of the Expressible, we can begin to discern a war waged by the United States against democratic and national improvement in Central America. We studied the countries of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala, and we learned that the U.S. government promoted authoritarian regimes of murderous brutality, including El Salvador and Guatemala, as well as maintained a local oligarchy in Honduras to keep starvation conditions alive, quote unquote, for the Honduran people, while there was no mass murder campaign as there was in the other client fascist regimes. In El Salvador, the media heaped praise on the sadistic bestial butcher of El Salvador, General Jose Napoleon Duarte, who was a mass murderer and torturer of his people. The U.S. terrorists of Congress endorsed Mr. Duarte's actions and hid his criminal, murderous brutality against his people for the sake of maintaining a subservient client regime. Similarly, in Guatemala, the U.S. terrorists of Congress funded lavishly the highly repressive regimes of Castillo Armas and brutality against the Guatemalan people, who were basically genocided by the butchers of Washington. Finally, in Nicaragua, the U.S. terrorist Congress and its media propagandists of the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest all maintained the congressional requirements of deceitful lies and painted the Sandinistas as a brutal regime of murder and torture and sought to overthrow them through the American terrorists of the Contras. They wrote letters to Daniel Ortega indicating that if he dare act in self-defense against the Contras, the U.S. was free to invade Nicaragua, as well as increase funding for the American terrorist organization of the Contras. The racists of Congress included Democrats Kennedy and Sanford, as well as several others, who threatened Nicaragua with military action should they protect themselves from Reagan's overthrow of the Sandinistas. As usual, America serves as a terrorist state of colonialism and enslavement, and not a democratic promoter of third world social progress. The Sandinistas were trying to improve medical care, social programs of the people, food distribution, and agribusiness were more equalized, and landholding equality was being attempted. The rot would spread, according to the racist Congress and Jimmy Carter, to mention one president, and hence Nicaragua had to be terrorized by the American machine gun government. We strongly advise you download and read the book of Necessary Illusions to really understand the deceptive and subconscious indoctrination that is done by the U.S. government in their pursuit of colonialism and racist oppression, enslavement, and subjugation. So we're going to continue with, adjuncts of government. One can imagine two ways in which the events of the Israeli-Palestine conflict might be presented in the media. One would be to report that the highest Palestinian authority has issued a declaration of independence, officially accepting the principle of partition. Furthermore, the PNC has even more clearly than before expressed PLO support for the broad international consensus in favor of a political settlement that recognizes the rights of Israel and the Palestinians to self-determination and security, and has officially reaffirmed its support for the stand in the international community, including the NATO powers, on the matter of terrorism. Meanwhile, the United States and Israel remain largely isolated on the first issue, keeping to their rejectionist position and again barring the peace process, and are entirely isolated in their opposition to the right of the people to struggle for freedom and self-determination against racist and colonial regimes and foreign occupation. And Israel alone refuses to accept UN Resolution 242, see below. A second alternative would be to dismiss the Declaration of Independence as an irrelevance, to ignore completely the isolation of the United States and Israel on the other issues, and to accept the U.S. position as by definition correct, as the moderate stance and the basis for any further discussion. Then we conduct a debate over whether the Palestinians should be encouraged to progress further towards moderation, now that, under our tutelage, they have taken these halting steps, or whether their stern mentor should simply dismiss these moves and demands that the PLO begins to be serious or disappear. The first version, which would have the merit of truth, is not to be found in the U.S. media. The second alternative not only prevailed, but was close to exceptionless. In the New York Times, the editors quoted the statement on terrorism, describing it as the old Arafat hedge, and failing to note that it reiterates the UN resolution that the United States and Israel alone reject. Anthony Lewis, who is virtually alone in the mainstream in his efforts to escape the bounds of dogma on these issues, deplored the failure to reward the PLO for its progress towards the U.S. stand, adding that it must become more clear in its political pronouncement that the United States says correctly that the PLO must unambiguously renounce all terrorism before it can take part in negotiation. He raises no questions about the clarity of the rejectionist U.S. stance and holds that the United States is right not to be fooled by the old Arafat hedge. That is the position accepted by the entire world community, apart from the United States and Israel, and of course, South Africa. Arafat does not join us off the spectrum of world opinion. Plainly, he cannot be taken seriously. Elsewhere, the same bounds were observed, often even more narrowly. In short, the world does not agree with us, so it follows by simple logic that the world is wrong. That is all that is to the matter. No alternative possibility can be discussed, even conceived. Still more strikingly, even the fact that the world does not agree with us cannot be acknowledged, since it fails to see the light the world outside our borders does not exist, Israel aside. We see here the grip of doctrine in a form that would have deeply impressed the medieval church or the mullahs of Qum today. Once again, the consequences should not be disregarded. The media's self-censorship over many years has enabled the United States and Israel to block what has long been a possible political settlement of one of the world's most explosive and threatening issues. That continued to be the case as the United States changed its increasingly untenable position on the discussions with the PLO under a fraudulent pretext while maintaining its commitment to obstruct the peace process. Senator Fulbright's observation is both pertinent and of much significance. Returning to coverage of the United Nations, a March 1988 story headlined UN to study rights in Cuba, USC's diplomatic victory, reported Cuba's invitation to the UN Human Rights Commission for an on-the-scene investigation, undercutting a U.S. campaign for a resolution condemning Cuba. The first 13 paragraphs present Washington's point of view, turning the failure into a great triumph of U.S. diplomacy. The last paragraph quotes a Cuban official stating that the outcome shows our continent's growing political unity in rejecting the U.S. effort. Another Times article reports a visit of American human rights specialists to Cuban prisons, with a line in the final paragraph noting, with no comment, that the State Department has dented visas to Cuban officials for a reciprocal visit to U.S. prisons, just as Reagan launched his human rights drive in Moscow. Unreported is a resolution on the Middle East passed by the Human Rights Commission on the same day as its rejection of the U.S. initiative on Cuba. The resolution passed 26-1, with the United States alone in opposition, expressed grave concern at the continuation of acts of aggression and the arbitrary practices of the Israeli occupation forces in southern Lebanon, which constitute a flagrant violation of international law, and called upon Israel's allies to pressure it to end its aggressive and expansionist policy in southern Lebanon. World opinion must pass through the same filters that set the bounds of respectability at home. Failing to meet these standards, it is ignored or subject to puzzled inquiry as to just why the world is out of step. The pattern, again, is pervasive. The government media campaign to demonize the Sandinistas faced a new challenge when the Central American presidents reached a peace agreement in August 1987. The Reagan administration had long sought to undercut diplomatic initiatives and bitterly condemning the Sandinistas for refusing to sign the Contadora draft of 1984. The administration quickly changed its tune when Nicaragua unexpectedly announced that it would sign, at which point the draft became a deception and a fraud, and the United States proceeded to undermine it with further denunciations of the treacherous Sandinistas. Washington tried all means available to block the signing of the Contadora Peace Act. Costa Rican Vice Foreign Affairs Minister Gerardo Trejo Salas observed in an unreported interview reviewing how the United States strongly pressured Costa Rica and its client states during 1985 to 1986 when he was a first-hand witness. Events followed the same course in June 1986 as we have seen. The Arias initiatives of 1987 were also most unwelcome to the Reagan administration. In June, its peace emissary, Philip Habib, informed high-ranking senators that if the administration felt its views and interests were not reflected in the regional arrangements, it would continue to fund the Nicaraguan Contra rebels, despite agreements reached by the Central American leaders, an advance notice that elicited little attention. In the same month, the administration pressured President Duarte to block a scheduled meeting of Central American presidents in Guatemala. A Guatemalan official reported that Duarte personally told Guatemala's president the reason he asked for the postponement was because of U.S. pressure applied by Habib. The Guatemalan and Honduran press published the dialogue between Habib and Duarte, as reported by Salvadoran officials to the Guatemalan government, then to the Guatemalan Congress. In the talks, Habib pressed Duarte to reject the Arias peace plan, informing him that the requirement that El Salvador negotiate with the unarmed opposition would destroy democracy in El Salvador. Duarte acceded and insisted upon postponement of the June meeting. The U.S. media were uninterested. Habib is regularly depicted as a forthright advocate of diplomacy and peace. In a last-ditch effort to undermine the peace agreement, Washington put forth the Reagan Right Plan on August 5th, calling for dismantling the political system in Nicaragua, an end to arms aid to Nicaragua, and demobilization of Sandinista forces. In return, the United States would pledge to halt shipments of arms to the Contras. This proposal received wide media acclaim as fair and just. The Iran-Contra hearings that had concluded 2 days earlier had passed into ancient history, along with their suggestion that a U.S. pledge might be worth less than gold. Nevertheless, to the surprise and annoyance of the administration, the Central American presidents reached an agreement on August 7th. Government propaganda then shifted, predictably, to the demolition of the unacceptable accords. The media followed faithfully along. I have reviewed the details elsewhere, so I will only summarize this most remarkable campaign. The problem to be addressed was a familiar one. A great power has been unable to impose its will and finds itself confronted with conditions and circumstances that it refuses to accept. A state that commands unusual powers, such as the United States, has a variety of ways to deal with the problem. One is to pretend that the adversary has capitulated, accepting the U.S. stand. This option can be perceived only if the information system can be trusted to fall into line, presenting the U.S. government version as it were true, however outlandish the pretense. If the media meet their responsibilities in this way, then the adversary must indeed accept U.S. terms or else suffer retribution for violating the alleged solemn commitment to adhere to them. One striking example of this technique was the treatment of the Paris Peace Treaty of January 1973, which the United States was compelled to sign after the failure of its attempt to bludgeon North Vietnam into submission by the Christmas B-52 bombings of populated areas. The U.S. government had once offered a version of this treaty that was diametrically opposed to its terms on every crucial point. This version was uniformly accepted and promulgated by the media, so that the actual terms of the peace treaty had been dismissed to the memory hole literally within a few days. The United States and South Vietnamese client then proceeded with massive violations of the actual treaty in an effort to attain their long-term goals of violence. And when the Vietnamese adversaries finally responded in kind, they were universally denounced for the breakdown of the agreements and compelled to suffer their crime. The case of Central America peace accords was similar. It was necessary to refashion them to conform to U.S. dictates, a task that was accomplished with the anticipated cooperation of the media, though it took a little longer than the overnight victory at the time of the Paris peace accords, perhaps an indication that the media really have become more adversarial than in the past. The first requirement of the demolition campaign was to establish that it was U.S. support for the Contras that had forced the Sandinistas to negotiate. This is always an important doctrine, since it can be exploited to justify subsequent resort to armed force and terror. The thesis hardly withstands the evidence of history. Nicaragua's efforts to pursue a peaceful means required by international law through the World Court, the United Nations, and the Contadora process, and Washington's success in quote-unquote trumping these initiatives. Such problems were readily overcome by dismissal of the facts to the memory hole. The required doctrinal truth then became the merest cliche. The New York Times editors could therefore criticize Michael Dukakis during the 1988 election campaign because he undervalues the role of force in bringing the Sandinistas to the beginning table. It would be unreasonable to expect troublesome facts to stand in the way of a principle that authorities continued reliance on violence as the necessary means for bringing peace. More generally, what is useful is true, period. The first task was accomplished with dispatch. The next problem was to dismantle the accords themselves. The first phase ran from the signing in August 1987 to January 1988, when the Central American presidents were to receive the report of the International Verification Commission, which was charged with monitoring the accords. The goal of the Reagan administration was to focus all attention on the Sandinistas, thus ensuring that the United States could maintain the attack by its proxy forces and exclude the U.S. client states from the provisions of the accords. The media at once dedicated themselves to these further tasks, and by January, the last shreds of the original accords disappeared, replaced by the initial U.S. terms. Henceforth, the irrelevant facts became of interest only to the archivists. It is the necessary illusions that prevail. The peace plan specified one indispensable element for peace, namely a termination of open or covert aid to any form of military, logistic, financial, propagandist, to irregular forces, the Contras or insurrectionist movements, indigenous guerrillas. In response, the United States at once stepped up its illegal CIA supply flights, which had already reached the phenomenal level of one a day, in an effort to keep the proxy forces in the field. These doubled in September and virtually tripled in the months that followed. Surveillance flights were also increased. Successes were immediately evident as counterattacks on civilians doubled in intensity, including ambushes, murders, attacks on farm cooperatives, and kidnappings. The CIA also offered bribes to Mosquito leaders to prevent them from joining the peace process. The peace agreements were thus effectively dead from the first moment. There were by far the most significant developments during the August to January phase of the Accords. The media responded to these unacceptable facts by suppressing them. The United States, of course, was not a signatory, so technically speaking, it could not violate the Accords. An honest accounting, however, would have noted, indeed emphasized, that the United States acted at once to render the accords nugatory. Nothing of the sort is to be found. Apart from the marginal groups with access to the alternative media, not subject to the code of discipline, even the most assiduous media addict could hardly have been more than minimally aware of these crucial facts. The behavior of the New York Times was particularly remarkable, including outright falsification, along with scrupulous suppression. A suppression of evidence concerning U.S. supply flights persisted after the accords were finally diminished in January 1988. Nicaraguan reports, which had been accurate and ignored in the past, continue to be ignored by the media as inconsistent with the images they seek to convey. In December 1988, Defense Minister Humberto Ortega alleged that the Reagan administration was continuing supply flights to Contras inside Nicaragua in violation of the congressional ban, not to speak of the forgotten peace accords and even the more profoundly irrelevant terms of international law. He claimed that Nicaraguan radar detected 10 clandestine supply flights into Nicaragua from Ilopango Air Base near San Salvador in November, the Hesen-Fesas route, adding that we are talking about CIA flights. We do not know if they have the approval of the Salvadoran government. Apart from faith in the doctrine of miraculous change, of course, there was little reason to doubt that report might be true. It was, as usual, ignored, and no investigation, commentary, or conclusions followed. These quite significant reports from Nicaragua were available to readers of the English language Barricade International, Managua, but not those of the New York Times or elsewhere. To my knowledge, attacks of the U.S.-run terrorist forces on civilians also continued, unreported in accordance with the great general pattern for years. The Accords called for quote-unquote justice, freedom, and democracy, and guarantees for the inviolability of all forms of life and liberty, and the safety of the people, for an authentic, pluralistic, and participatory democratic process to promote social justice and respect for human rights. These provisions were also unacceptable to the United States because they plainly could not be met or even approached in the U.S. client state without the dismantling of the governmental structure dominated by the armed forces and security services. Having eliminated the provisions applying to the United States, the media therefore faced a second task to remove the practice of the client states from the agenda. This problem was readily overcome by the same means: simple refusal to report the facts, or marginalization and distortion when they were too visible to ignore entirely. State terror in the United States client states escalated, but no matter, the laser-like focus of the media was on Nicaragua, which received far more coverage than the other countries combined. Virtually all of it was concentrating on departures from the Accords as interpreted in Washington. Another unacceptable feature of the Accords was the role given by to international monitors, the CIVS. The United States brooks no interference in its domains, hence the longstanding U.S. opposition to the peace efforts of the Latin American democracies, and now to the CIVS as well. Furthermore, the CIVS presence would inhibit violation of the Accords, thus interfering with U.S. intentions. The first phase of the Accords ended in January with a report by the CIVS, which had bad taste to condemn the United States and its clients while praising steps taken by Nicaragua. Obviously, it had to go. The Times cooperated by virtually suppressing the CIVS report, and under U.S. pressure, the Monitoring Commission was abolished. The victory was complete. Not a shred of the original agreements remained. Nicaragua responded by announcing that it would satisfy the terms of the former accords unilaterally, requesting international supervision to monitor its agreement alone. The loyal media responded by announcing that finally Nicaragua had agreed to comply with the peace accords, though, of course, communists cannot be trusted. Meanwhile, state terror state terror escalated in client states without, however, influencing the judgment that Nicaragua bore prime responsibility for violating the accords, the correct response given that the United States and its clients were now exempt by Washington media edict. In the Times, the terror was barely noted, apart from the guerrilla terror in El Salvador, to which the government sometimes responded. James Lemoyne commented with regret. In October 1988, Amnesty International released a report on the sharp increase in death squad killings, torture, abduction, mutilation, tracing the terror to the government security forces. The Times ignored the story while the Senate passed a resolution warning Nicaragua that new military aid would be sent to the Contras if the Sandinistas continued to violate the peace accords. Returning to January 1988, with the accords now restricted to the question of Nicaraguan compliance with Washington's dictates, the crucial issue became the willingness of the Sandinistas to negotiate with the CIA-established civilian front for Washington's proxy forces. The accords themselves required no such negotiations, as was occasionally noted in the small print, but they had long been since dismissed to oblivion. In early 1988, Nicaragua did agree to this U.S. condition, reaching an unexpected ceasefire agreement with the Contras. Meanwhile, the indigenous guerrillas in El Salvador and Guatemala were consistently rebuffed in their efforts to negotiate, but these facts were suppressed as irrelevant in conformity with the Washington media version of the accords. Were not suppressed, the facts were simply denied, as when Jeane Kirkpatrick wrote in June that Duarte has seen generous offers of amnesty and negotiations rejected by the FMLN guerrillas one by one. The pronouncement following Duarte's rejection of a series of efforts by the FMLN, the political opposition, and the church to arrange negotiations, the generous offer of amnesty, as Kirkpatrick fully understands, would be an offer to be slaughtered by the death squads, quite apart from the fact that the Duarte government, unlike the Sandinistas, was refusing amnesty for guerrilla leaders. The Nicaraguan ceasefire was signed on March 23rd. The agreement stated that only humanitarian aid will be negotiated and accepted in accordance with Article 5 of the August 1987 Accords to be channeled through new natural organizations. Organization of American States, OAS, Secretary General João Clemente Baena Soares was entrusted with ensuring compliance with the agreement. Congress responded by voting overwhelmingly to violate the terms of the ceasefire, approving $47.9 million in aid to the Contras to be administered by the State Department through the Agency for International Development, AID. The aid would be delivered in Honduras and within Nicaragua by a private company. James Lemoyne reported, quoting Contra leader Alfredo Caesar, the phrase private company is a euphemism for the CIA, for which aid has admittedly served as a front in the past. Contra leader Adolfo Calero stated that the ceasefire agreement allowed for delivery of aid to the Nicaraguan border by the CIA, and Democratic Congressperson David Benur added that the rebels would select a private carrier. By no stretch of the imagination, aid can be considered a neutral organization. The congressional legislation stipulated that all aid must be administered in a manner consistent with the March 23rd ceasefire agreement and in accord with the decisions of the Verification Commission established by that agreement, for which the Secretary General Soares was the responsible authority. In a letter to George Shultz on April 25, Soares drew his attention to this passage of the congressional legislation and stated that reliance on aid was in clear violation of the ceasefire agreement, expressing his deep concern about this whole situation. He emphasized further that Article 5 of the Peace Accords, which determines how aid shall be delivered under the ceasefire agreement, quite explicitly rules out any assistance whatsoever to the Contras, except for repatriation or resettlement. Aid can be sent to the Contras within Nicaragua by means agreed to both sides as a means toward their reintegration into normal life, but for no other end. The objections of the official in charge of monitoring the agreement were disregarded, in fact, unreported to my knowledge, and the illegal operations continued. It should be interesting to learn whether any reference appeared in the U.S. media to the decision of the World Court concerning quote unquote humanitarian aid, paragraph 243. If such aid is to escape condemnation as illegal intervention, the court declared, not only must it be limited to the purposes hallowed in the practice of the Red Cross, namely to prevent and alleviate human suffering, and to protect life and health, and to ensure respect for the human being. It must also, and above all, be given without discrimination to all in need of Nicaragua, not merely to the Contras and their dependents. An essential feature of truly humanitarian aid is that it is given without discrimination of any kind. Even the most imaginative commentators would have some difficulty in rendering that judgment compatible with the congressional legislation. Best then to suppress the matter as an easy matter in an intellectual culture that disdains the rule of law as a childish absurdity when it applies to us, and that conforms to the requirements of the powerful virtually as a reflex. The Times report on the decision of Congress to fund the Contras in violation of the ceasefire agreement, the peace accords, and international law cited views ranging from hawks who condemned the sellout of the Contras as a low point in the United States history, Senator John McCain, to Senator Brock Adams, who voted against the aid proposal on the grounds that the United States' attempt to create a government through the Contras is a historic mistake, similar to our trying to create a government in Southeast Asia. We are in a position again of supporting military force without victory. These two questions also appeared in quotations of the day. Appropriately, the highlighted opinion falls well within the acceptable bounds of a mere tactical disagreement. Aid head Alan Woods said that the aid would have to be delivered by private American aircraft, and that there was no assurance that the Sandinistas would permit such airdrops to the Contras within Nicaragua in violation of the ceasefire agreement, as General Source had determined. The Times article reporting this is headed, "Officials Sees Problems on Contra Aid. The big hurdle is Sandinista mistrust." Aid then began delivering supplies to Contras in Honduras, violating the congressional legislation that stipulated that the aid was to be delivered in ceasefire zones, all of which are in Nicaragua, and violating the ceasefire agreements for the reasons already spelled out. For one, because aid, a U.S. agency, clearly is not a neutral organization. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs pointed out, noting the protest by Soares and the Nicaraguan complaint that weapons originating from the CIA bases at Swan Island, Honduras, had been concealed in the banned shipments. Wire services reported that Nicaragua had offered to have supplies sent to the Contras through the Red Cross or other neutral agencies, and that representatives of rebel Indian groups agreed with the government that the International Red Cross should handle distribution of humanitarian aid to them, offers rejected or ignored by the U.S. government and its proxies. The Democratic Study Group of Congress issued a report condemning the administration for numerous violations of the ceasefire agreement and the congressional legislation. It noted that the Sandinistas had proposed the Red Cross, UNICEF, and other recognized relief agencies as delivery agents, but that all but one of them had been rejected by aid, which proposed several organizations with right-wing political ties and no experience in Latin America. The study group reported also that the Sandinistas had invited the Contras to propose another agency, receiving no response from the Contras, not surprisingly, since they were being supplied in violation of the ceasefire agreement. The report also noted that while sending aid illegally to the Contras, the administration had refused to provide assistance to the families of Indian rebels and would only supply fighters based in Honduras, using a company that had carried supplies to the Contras. The facts were largely ignored by the Times, which offered a different version. James Lemoyne reported that because the Sandinistas have managed to obstruct efforts to supply the rebels, as called for under the ceasefire terms, they may attack them at a moment of maximum weakness when the ceasefire ends. Robert Pear alleged that President Ortega has blocked deliveries of the aid authorized by Congress on grounds that the deliveries would violate the ceasefire agreement. Unmentioned was the fact that this was also the conclusion of the official charge of monitoring the agreement. The name did appear in the article, but only in the context of the Reagan administration decision that he had not met their financial accountability standards, so that they had not dispersed the $10 million provided by Congress for the commission to verify compliance with the ceasefire agreement as an understandable reaction to verification mechanisms when the U.S. government is intent on violating agreements and international law with the protection of the media. In further violation of both the ceasefire agreements and the congressional legislation, the Reagan administration sent funds to the Contras to spend as they wished, a method regarded by aid as sufficient accounting. Congressperson Tony Colo commented sardonically. Aid officials announced that in addition to food aid, more than $1 million in material, military equipment, and supplies also was delivered, though not weapons and ammunition, the Washington Times reported. Congress had legislated the delivery of aid to Nicaraguan children, stipulating, however, that no assistance may be provided to or through the government of Nicaragua, which operates for most medical facilities and hospitals. Aid particularly gave the conditions the narrowest interpretation, thus effectively restricting the rather cynical gesture on the part of those funding the unlawful use of force against Nicaragua. Aid also rejected offers by nonpartisan humanitarian organizations to deliver aid to Nicaraguan children. A letter from Brown University Medical School offering to submit a detailed proposal to distribute this aid was not even acknowledged. The Nicaraguan government later refused all such aid as long as the United States supports the Contras on grounds that it makes no sense to receive aid for children from the same body that is responsible for their injuries, the embassy press officer said. It's like someone giving you a beating, and then to relieve his conscience, he gives you a Band-Aid. Then he gives you another beating. The national media remained unperturbed throughout, in accordance with the doctrine that the United States stands above the law or international agreement, and needless to say, above any moral principle. Meanwhile, the U.S. Treasury Department announced a new ruling that barred import of Nicaraguan coffee processed in a third country, which will not be considered sufficiently transformed to lose its Nicaraguan identity. It suffices to replace Nicaraguan, quote unquote, with quote unquote Jewish to know in which phase of history this edict belongs. The language echoes definition of ethnic purity in the Third Reich, the Boston Globe observed. During the same months, negotiations on a political settlement broke down through the device of demand escalation by the Contras, no doubt following the State Department script. Each new government going far beyond the terms of the long-forgotten peace accords simply led to new demands. In their final effort to prevent an agreement, the Contras submitted a new list of demands on June 9, 1988, including immediate freezing of all people in prison for political or related common crimes, the right of draftees to leave the army as they choose, forced resignation of the Supreme Court justices to be replaced by decision of the Contras, the opposition, and the government, thus ensuring Washington's clients a 2-to-1 majority, restoration of or compensation for seized Contra property distributed to smallholders and cooperatives benefiting mainly Somoza supporters, suspension of government military recruitment, opening of Contra offices in Managua, and licensing of independent television stations, which means, in effect, stations run by the United States, which will quickly dominate the airwaves for obvious reasons of resource access. All of these actions, some unconstitutional, were to be taken by the government while the Contra forces remain armed in the field. Reviewing the record, Center for International Policy observed that the goal could only have been to torpedo the negotiations and throw the issue back once more to a divided U.S. Congress. Julia Preston commented that the Contra's 6-page proposal appeared to be a farewell gesture rather than a negotiating document, with its sweeping new demands followed by their quick departure from Managua before negotiations were possible. The government of Nicaragua urged resumption of the talks, receiving no response from Washington or the Contras, who added new demands. Even Cardinal Obando, who barely conceals his sympathy for the Contras, urged them to return to the talks to no avail. There followed what the Council of Hemispheric Affairs described as a CIA-managed campaign of provocation and internal disruption inside Nicaragua, which established a false crisis atmosphere in which the Congress could turn to new aid for the Contras. Congressional doves implemented legislation providing new aid while warning the Sandinistas that military aid would follow if Nicaragua continued to stand alone in the way of peace and democracy or attack the Contra forces who reject negotiations and carry out atrocities in Nicaragua. The media trailed happily along. As the Reagan administration drew to a close, it was becoming less realistic and less necessary to rely on Contra-terror as an instrument to punish Nicaragua for its efforts to direct U.S. resources to the poor majority, to improve health and welfare standards, and to pursue the path of independent development and neutralization. Despite levels and forms of military support unheard of in authentic insurgencies and domination of large areas of Nicaragua by U.S. propaganda, the United States had failed to create a viable guerrilla force, quite a remarkable fact. A new administration less intent on punishing disobedience by sheer terror would be likely to join the elite consensus of the preceding years, which recognized that there are more cost-effective ways to struggle and destroy a small country in a region and dependent on relations with the United States for survival. They are capable of understanding the assessment of a World Bank mission in October 1980, which concluded that the economic disaster might ensue if Nicaragua did not receive extensive foreign assistance to overcome the effects of the destruction and robbery of the last Somoza years. Per capita income levels of 1977 will not be attained in the best of circumstances until the 1990s. With private enterprise wrecked and the economy ruined probably beyond repair by U.S. economic warfare, the resort to violence, costly to the United States in world opinion and disruptive at home, had lost much of its appeal for those who do not see inflicting pain and suffering as ends in themselves. There are surely other and more efficient ways to eliminate the danger of successful independent development in a weak and tiny country. We can then become a kinder, gentler nation, pursuing more pragmatic policies to attain our goals. Furthermore, although the government media campaign succeeded in wrecking the peace accords of 1987 and their promise, nevertheless, forces were set in motion that the administration could not control. Illegal clandestine support for the Contras became more difficult after the partial exposures during the Iran-Contra affair, and it was no longer possible to organize overt congressional support for the Contras at the extraordinary level required to keep them in the field. As the level of supply flights reduced in early 1988, along with the prospects for renewed official aid, the proxy forces fled to Honduras and might well have been wiped out had it not been for the dispatch of elite U.S. military units. The invasion of Honduras by the United States, as the mainstream media there described it, the defense of Honduras from Sandinista aggression in the terms of U.S. discourse. Elements of the Contras can and presumably will be maintained within Nicaragua as a terrorist force to ensure that Nicaragua cannot demobilize and divert its pitifully limited resources to reconstruction from the ruins left by Somoza and Reagan. A persistent U.S. threat of invasion can also be maintained to guarantee that Nicaragua must keep up its guard at great cost while commentators ridicule Sandinista paranoia, Jeane Kirkpatrick style. But it will no longer be necessary to depict the Contras as the people, united, rising against their tormentors, sturdy peasants, smuggling against Soviet hegemonism, as the media's favorite experts had soberly explained. By early 1989, we read the Sandinista claims that the Contras were merely U.S. mercenaries gained new credence among Nicaraguans. The Contras are viewed as an army of Nicaraguans, although they would get well-paid, secure jobs from the United States, but guessed wrong. Low-level terror, perception management, and containment would compel the Nicaraguan government to maintain a high level of military preparation and internal controls, and along with economic and ideologic warfare should suffice to secure the achievements of Reaganite violence. Even if further goal of restoring Nicaragua to the Central American mode must be ruefully abandoned. That is what the future holds if the domestic population of the United States permits it. The task of the media is to ensure that they do. The devastating hurricane of October 1988, and with its welcome prospects of mass starvation and vast long-term ecological damage, reinforced this understanding. The United States naturally refused any aid. Even the inhabitants of the demolished town of Bluefields on the Atlantic coast, with long-standing links to the United States and deep resentment over Sandinista methods of extending Nicaraguan sovereignty over the region, must be deprived of sustenance or building materials. They must starve without roofs to shield them from the rain, to punish the Sandinistas. At the outer reaches of the mainstream criticism of Reagan administration, the Boston Globe explained in a Christmas message why the United States is sending no assistance after the hurricane. Under a picture of Daniel Ortega, the caption reads, "Nicaragua has received little U.S. humanitarian aid because of the policies of Daniel Ortega. The U.S. allies, intimidated by the global enforcer and far more subject to U.S. propaganda than they like to believe, also refused to send more than very limited aid. Some profess distaste for the Sandinista repression, pure hypocrisy, as we shall at once see from the fact that far more brutal regimes of El Salvador and Guatemala do not offend the sensibilities." Under these circumstances, the task for the media is clear. First, they must apply the standard technique of historical amnesia and change of course, which obliterates all memory of U.S. policies and their effects. Virtually a reflex, this device can be applied instantaneously. With the record and effects of U.S. violence removed from consciousness, along with the nature and consequences of U.S. economic warfare that have always been downplayed, we turn to the next phase. All suffering, discontent, and disruption are now plainly attributable to the evil Sandinistas. It is also useful to imply that the Nicaraguans see the matter the same way by careful selection of sources or misinterpretation of polls. For example, a fine model is presented in the three-part series on Nicaragua by Edward Sheehan in the liberal Boston Globe, headline, "A Country Still in Agony." The three lengthy articles bitterly denouncing the Sandinistas throughout contain exactly one phrase that notes in passing that the United States is partially to blame for Nicaragua's sorrow and the wrecked economy. For Nicaragua's agony, the Sandinistas are responsible. Apart from all else, moral cowardice remains astonishing, however often the record is replayed. So that's that, however often the record is replayed. For intelligent U.S. planners, it would be sensible to avoid the total destruction of Nicaragua or even its reincorporation within the Central American mode. As liberal opinion prefers, it can then serve as an object lesson for poor countries that might be tempted to go berserk with fanatical nationalism. As the New York Times editors thundered when the CIA successfully overthrew the parliamentary regime in Iran, in a conflict with a third world country, a violent superpower with only limited internal constraints can hardly fail to achieve the goal of destroying any hope. The U.S. achievements in Central America in the past decade are a major tragedy, not only because of the appalling human cost, but because a decade ago there were incipient and promising steps throughout the region towards popular organization and confronting basic human needs. With earlier successes that might have taught useful lessons to others plagued with similar problems, exactly the fears of U.S. planners, These steps have been successfully aborted and may never be attempted again. The achievements of the Reagan administration in Nicaragua reveal to the cold statistics of corpses, malnutrition, childhood epidemics, and the like take on a more human cast in the occasional glimpses in the lives of victims. Julia Preston provides one of the rare examples in the mainstream media under the headline, "In Jalapa, war-induced hardships are bolstering the Sandinistas' cause." Jalapa, Preston writes, is a tiny town in a vulnerable finger of land poking into hostile Honduras, an area readily accessible to the sons of Reagan in their Honduran bases and largely dominated by hostile propaganda from powerful U.S.-run radio stations in Honduras. Here, if anywhere, the Contras could apply the lessons imparted to them by their CIA trainers and exhibit the growing self-confidence and skill that so impressed A.M. Rosenthal as he read James Lemoyne carefully reported sensitive accounts. In Jalapa, the Contras are an object of contempt, Preston writes. Mercenaries who guessed wrong about the well-paid secure jobs they would get from the United States. But this Contra war has left Jalapa's enduring penury far worse than they were ever known before. Severe hunger is rampant. The hospital, built in 1982, is a symbol of Sandinistas' commitment to improving social conditions, is nearly empty because people doubt it will have the means to take care of them, thanks to the diversion of resources to the war and away from this kind of social project, an achievement to which U.S. citizens can feel proud. Nevertheless, this immense hardship has not turned Jalapa against the Sandinistas' revolution. Even anti-Sandinista townspeople view the war as a new stage in U.S. bullying of everyday Nicaragua, of which the Somoza family dynasty was an indelible example. The literacy campaign and educational explosion, sharply curtailed by U.S. violence, attract abiding loyalty in Jalapa, if not the United States, where they have been much derided as an instrument of totalitarianism. Many residents of the town see a more informal, egalitarian society. Peasants are no longer servile and landowners superior, and under the Somoza regime and the U.S. model generally, the Sandinistas made brand credit available for the first time to small farmers, and today everyone shares the same poverty, though with a cry of frustration over Reagan's success in having delayed a revolution, a gaunt peasant farmer says. The long-term goals of the Reagan administration for Central America were clear from the outset. While Schultz, Abrams, Kirkpatrick, and company occupy an extreme position on the political spectrum in their enthusiasm for terror and violence, the general policy goals and conventional and deeply rooted in U.S. tradition, policy planning, and institutions, which is why they have received little attention or criticism within the mainstream. For the same reasons they can be expected to persist. It is necessary to demolish the People's Organization, fighting to defend their most fundamental human rights, Archbishop Romero, and to eliminate any threat of ultranationalism in the fledgling democracies. As for Nicaragua, if it cannot be restored by violence to the Central American mode of repression and exploitation, then at least the United States must implement the reported boast of a State Department insider in 1981 to turn Nicaragua into Albania of Central America, that is poor, isolated, and radical. The U.S. government must ensure that Nicaragua will become a sort of Latin American Albania, so that the Sandinista dream of creating a new, more exemplary political model for Latin America would be in ruins. British journalist John Carlin. The goals have, for the most part, been achieved. The independent media deserves a large share of the credit, serving as adjuncts of the government. So that's the completion of the chapter, adjuncts of the government. Like we see, the capitalist elite, the same basic ideas. The capitalist elite put down the information. Congress takes the capitalist elite aims. Nicaragua is trying to nationalize things. They're trying to make social programs for themselves, draw money from Washington's, racists, and they get the stick, they get the violence that the U.S. government has in store. We saw the Boston Globe wrote an article that says Nicaragua has received little U.S. humanitarian aid because of the policies of President Daniel Ortega. Obviously, this is fraud. This is deception. This is fraud. This is media fraud. It's deliberate lies. The U.S. media is a deliberate lying state of frauds. They're white frauds and, frauds. They just say that, Nicaragua's received little aid, not because of the Daniel Ortega, because the U.S. government are terrorists. It is a terrorist state of whites, and they terrorize the Nicaraguan people. The goal of the people of Nicaragua is to improve their conditions. Why is that contesting with Washington's objectives? It is because the white terrorists of Washington do not allow third world peoples to advance their progress. They do not allow third world progress. As we said, America is a terrorist state, and the U.S. Congress are white terrorists. Over and over, Congress voted in support of policies to murder the Nicaraguan people. Over and over, terrorism was endorsed by the United States Congress. You can see 48 million was, approved by Congress. Congress voted overwhelmingly to violate the terms of the ceasefire of the Sandinistas and approved 48 million in aid to the Contras. Over and over, the U.S. government approves terrorism against the Nicaraguan government, and the Congress voted over and over. So we again state the facts, the obvious. The U.S. government is a terrorist state. America is a terrorist state, and the United States Congress are white terrorists. So continuing on, the utility of interpretations. Hypocrisy, Milton wrote, is the only evil that walks invisible except to God alone. To ensure that neither man nor angel can discern the evil is, nonetheless, a demanding vocation. Pascal had discussed it a few years earlier while recording how the casuists reconcile the contrarieties between their opinions and the decisions of the popes, the councils, and the scripture. One of the methods in which we reconcile these contraindications, his casuist interlocutor explains, is by the interpretation of some phrase. Thus, if the gospel says, give alms to your superfluity, and the task is to discharge the wealthiest from the obligation of almsgiving, the matter is easily put to rights by giving such an interpretation to the world. Superfluity that will seldom or never happen, that anyone is troubled with such an article. Learned scholars demonstrate that what men of the world lay up to improve their circumstances or those of their relatives cannot be termed superfluity, and accordingly such a thing of superfluity is seldom to be found among men of the world, not even excepting kings. Nowadays we call it tax reform. We may then adhere faithfully to the preachings of the gospel that the rich are bound to give alms of their superfluity, though it will seldom or never happen to be obligatory in practice. There you see the utility of interpretations, he concludes. In our own times, the device, thanks to Orwell, called newspeak, the casuists are no less accomplished, though less forthcoming about the practice than Pascal's monk. In the last two chapters, noting the recommendation of the liberal intellectuals that with the advance of knowledge, we should keep to subtle and refined methods of social control, avoiding coarse, obvious, and direct methods, I discussed some of the modalities of thought control developed in the democratic societies. The most effective device is the bounding of the thinkable, achieved by tolerating debate, even encouraging it, though only within proper limits. But democratic systems also resort to cruder means, the method of interpretation of some phrase being a notable instrument. The aggression and state terror in the third world become defense of democracy and human rights, and democracy is successfully achieved when the government is safely in the hands of the rich men developing at peace within their habituations, as Winston Churchill's prescription for world order. At home, the rule of the privileged must be guaranteed and the population reduced to the status of passive observers, while in the dependencies, stern measures may be needed to eliminate any challenge to the natural rulers. Under the proper interpretation of the phrase, it is indeed true that the yearning to see American-style democracy duplicated throughout the world has been a persistent theme in American foreign policy, as Times correspondent Neil Lewis declared. There is, accordingly, no contrariety when we yearn for democracy and independence for South Vietnam while demolishing the country to eradicate the NLF, then turning to the destruction of politically organized Buddhists before permitting state-managed elections, quote unquote. Casuistry even permits us to proceed on this course while recognizing that until compelled by U.S. terror to use counterforce to survive, the indigenous enemy insisted that its contest with the United States and its clients should be fought out at the political level, and that the use of mass military might was in itself illegitimate. Our rejection of politics in favor of military might is natural because we also recognize that the NLF and no one, with the possible exception of the Buddhists, thought themselves equal in size and power to risk entering a coalition, fearing that if they did, the whale would swallow the minnow. With the same reasoning, it was only proper to subvert the first and last free election in the history of Laos because the wrong people won, to organize support to overthrow the elected governments in Guatemala, Brazil, and Dominican Republic, the Philippines, Chile, and Nicaragua, to support or directly organize large-scale terrorism, to bar the threat of democracy, social reform, and independence in Central America in the 1980s, to take strong measures to ensure that the post-war world would return to proper hands, and much else, all in our yearning for democracy, quote unquote. From the same perspective, we can understand why, in December 1965, the New York Times editorship praised Washington for having wisely stayed in the background during recent upheaval in Indonesia. In recent upheavals, the Indonesian military had defused the country's political time bomb, the powerful Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, by eliminating virtually all the top and second level leaders of the PKI in one or another manner, and incidentally slaughtering hundreds of thousands of people, mostly landless peasants, while Washington, quote unquote, wisely observed in silence, the editors chose to believe. The concomitant of a welcome victory for freedom was not mentioned, though the editors did warn at the social conditions that enabled the PKI to organize 14 million people persisted. They urged Washington to remain cautious about providing aid to the perpetrators of the slaughter, for fear that the national leaders Sukarno and the remnants of the PKI might yet benefit, despite the encouraging achievements of the friends and allies of the United States in conducting the largest slaughter since the Holocaust. Similarly, it is natural that the New York Times should praise the government of the Shah of Iran, restored to power by the CIA, for its highly successful campaign against subversive elements and its long record of success in defeating subversion without suppressing democracy. The subversives now thankfully suppressed without suppressing democracy include the pro-Soviet Tudeh party, formerly a real menace but considered now to have been completely liquidated, and the extreme nationalists, who had been almost as subversive as the communists. And few apparently find it jarring to read an upbeat report on the return of full democracy in the Philippines under the headline Aquino's Decree Bans Communist Party, with a lead paragraph explaining that a presidential decree stipulated penalties of imprisonment for membership in the party, which has been legalized under the Marcos dictatorship. Not long before, Marcos himself had a model Democrat, a man's pledge to democracy, as Ronald Reagan explained. We love your adherence to democratic principle and to the democratic process, and your service to freedom, his Vice President George Bush proclaimed in Manila. That, however, was far before Marcos had lost control and with his credentials as a freedom-loving Democrat. On the same principles, we can recall with nostalgia the days of democracy under the Diem and Thu Khai dictatorships in South Vietnam, and what is more natural than to observe proudly that democracy is on the ideologic march, because the experience of the last several decades showed that if it leads to prosperity and development as an economic measurement, as an economic mechanism, democracy demonstrably works. James Markham writes in the lead article in the Times Week in Review, economic growth has indeed occurred in the newly industrializing countries, notably South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. We are to understand then that democracy is a system that rejects democratic forms so as to facilitate reduced consumption and super exploitation with state control over the economy in coordination with domestic conglomerates and international corporations. a pattern closer to traditional fascism than to democracy. All makes sense, however, when we take the term quote unquote democracy to mean domination of the economy and social and political life by domestic elements that are properly sensitive to the needs of corporations and the US government. These are constant themes in the media and political system, reflecting broader norms. There are no contrarieties here, as long as we understand the proper interpretation of the term democracy. All of this is quite in accord with the doctrine of other countries that other countries should control their own destinies unless developments get out of control and affect U.S. interests adversely. The logic is similar when a national intelligence estimate of 1955 discusses the quandary the United States faced in Guatemala after the successful overthrow of the democratic capitalist regime. Many Guatemalans are passionately attached to the democratic national ideals of the 1944 revolution, particularly to the social and economic programs of the regimes overthrown by the CIA coup. The study observes with some distress, but few Guatemalans understand the processes and responsibilities of democracy, so that the responsible democratic government is therefore difficult to achieve. The apparent contradiction is dispelled when we give the proper interpretation to democracy. It is the task of the media and the specialized class generally to ensure that the hypocrisy walks invisible except to God alone. As we see from these and many other examples, a solicitous concern for democracy and human rights may go hand in hand with tolerance for large-scale slaughter or direct participation in it. The Christian Science Monitor observed approvingly and accurately that after General Suharto's impressive achievement in eliminating the political threat in Indonesia by mass murder, many in the West were keen to cultivate Jakarta's new moderate leader, Suharto. Here, the term, quote, moderate is used with an appropriate casuistic interpretation. Suharto's subsequent achievements include extraordinary human rights violations at home and slaughter in the course of aggression in East Timor that bears comparison to Pol Pot in the same years, backed enthusiastically by the United States, with the effective support of Canada, Britain, France, and other guardians of morality. The media cooperated by simply eliminating the issue. New York Times coverage, for example, declined as atrocities increased along with U.S. participations, reaching zero as the atrocities peaked in 1978. And the few comments by noted Southeast Asia correspondent Henry Kam assured us on the authority of the Indonesian generals that the army was protecting the people, fleeing from the control of the guerrillas. Scrupulously excluded was the testimony of refugees, church officials, and others who might have interfered with public acquiescence in what appears to have been the largest massacre relative to the population since the Holocaust. In retrospect, the London Economist, in an ode to Indonesia under General Suharto's rule, describes him as at heart benign, referring perhaps to his kindness to international corporations. In accord with the same principles, it is natural that vast outrage should be evoked by the terror of the Pol Pot regime, while reporters in Phnom Penh in 1973, when the U.S. bombing of populated areas of rural Cambodia reached its peak, should ignore the testimony of hundreds of thousands of refugees before their eyes. Such selective perception guarantees that little is known about the scale and character of these U.S. atrocities, though enough to indicate that they may have been comparable to those attributable to the Khmer Rouge at the time when the chorus of indignation swept the West in 1977, and that they contributed significantly to the rise and probably the brutality of the Khmer Rouge. These achievements of the historical engineering, quote unquote, allow the editors of the New York Times to observe that when America's eyes turned away from Indochina in 1975, Cambodia's misery had just begun with the infamous barbarities of the Khmer Rouge, then dreary occupation by Vietnam, is incidentally expelling the Khmer Rouge. Although long indifference they continued, Washington can now play an important role as honest broker and heal a long ignored wound in Cambodia. The misery began in 1975, not before under America's eyes, And the editors do not remind us that during the period of, quote, indifference, Washington offered indirect support to the Khmer Rouge while backing the coalition in which it was a major element because of its continuity with the Pol Pot regime. U.S. relations with the Khmer Rouge require some careful maneuvering. The Khmer Rouge were and remain utterly evil insofar as they can be associated with the communist threat, perhaps because of their origins in Jean-Paul Sartre's left-wing Paris circles. Even more evil, evidently, are the Vietnamese, who finally reacted to brutal and murderous border incidents by invading Cambodia and driving out the Khmer Rouge, terminating their slaughters. We therefore must back our Thai and Chinese allies who support Pol Pot. All of this requires commentators to step warily. The New York Times reports the reluctance in Washington to push too hard to pressure China to end its support for Pol Pot, with the goal of bleeding Vietnam, as our Chinese allies have forthrightly explained. The Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs rejected a congressional plea to call for a cutoff of aid to Pol Pot because the situation was delicate. U.S. pressure on China might irritate relations unnecessarily, the Times explained, and this consideration overcomes our passionate concern over the fate of Cambodians exposed to Khmer Rouge terror. The press explains further that while naturally the United States is one of the nations most concerned about a Khmer Rouge return, nevertheless, the U.S. and allies have decided that without some sign of compromise by Vietnam toward a political settlement on U.S. terms, the Khmer Rouge forces must be allowed to serve as military pressure on Vietnam, despite their past and despite that population, what the population may think about a Khmer Rouge return. Not only relations with China, but also the tasks of propagandists are delicate under these demanding conditions. An appropriate casuistic interpretation of the concept of democracy solves only half the problem. We also need a phrase for the enemies of democracy in some country where we yearn to establish or maintain it. The reflex device is to label the indigenous enemy communists, whatever their social commitments and political allegiances may be. They must be eliminated in favor of the Democrats, who are not out of control. Jose Napoleon Duarte and his defense minister, Vides Casanova, are therefore Democrats defending civilization against communists, such as the hundreds murdered by the security forces as they tried to flee Honduras across the Rio Sumpol in May 1980. They were all communist guerrillas, Duarte explained, including presumably infants sliced to pieces with machetes under Jimmy Carter. The U.S. media took the simpler path of suppressing the massacre, one of the opening shots in the terrorist campaign for which Duarte proved legitimacy to much acclaim. The U.S. attitude towards American-style democracies illustrates the prevailing conception in more subtle ways. Europe and Japan provide interesting examples, particularly in the early post-war years when it was necessary to restore traditional elites to power and undermine the anti-fascist resistance and its supporters, many of them imbued with unacceptable radical democratic commitments. The Third World provides a few similar illustrations standing alongside the many cases where people with the wrong ideas are controlled by violence or liquidated without suppressing democracy, quote unquote. Consider Costa Rica, the one functioning parliamentary democracy in Central America through the post-World War II period. It is sometimes argued, even by scholars who should know better, that U.S. support for Costa Rica undermines the thesis that a policy goal is to bar nationalistic regimes that do not adequately guarantee the rights of business, a thesis well supported by documentary and historical records. The argument reflects a serious misunderstanding. The United States has no principled opposition to democratic forms as long as the climate for business operations is preserved, and accurately observed by Gordon Connell Smith in his study of the Inter-American System for the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The U.S. concept of democracy is closely identified with private capitalistic enterprise, and it is only when this is threatened by what is regularly called communism, quote unquote, that action is taken to restore democracy The United States' concern for representative democracy in Latin America as elsewhere is a facet of her anti-communist policy, or more accurately, the policy of opposing any threat to U.S. economic penetration and political control. And when these interests are safeguarded, democratic forms may not only be tolerated but approved, if only for public relations reasons. Costa Rica fits the model closely and provides interesting insight into the yearning for democracy that is alleged to guide U.S. foreign policy. In Costa Rica, the system established under the leadership of Jose Figueres after the 1948 coup remains in place. It has always provided a warm welcome to foreign investment and has promoted a form of class collaboration that often sacrifices the rights of labor. Jose Don Pepe Figueres, biographer, observes, while establishing a welfare system that continues to function thanks to U.S. subsidies with one of the highest per capita debts in the world, Don Pepe's 1949 Constitution outlawed communism, with the most militant unions suppressed, labor rights declined, minimum wage laws were not enforced, and workers lost every collective bargaining contract except the one that covered a single group of banana workers. Walter Lefebvre notes, by the 1960s, it was almost as if the entire labor movement had ceased to exist. An academic study concludes. The United Fruit Company prospered, nearly tripling its profits and facing no threat of expropriation. Meanwhile, Figueres declared in 1953 that we consider the United States as the standard bearer of our cause. As the United States tried to line up Latin American states behind its planned overthrow of the Guatemalan government, Costa Rica and Bolivia were the only two elected governments to join the Latin American dictatorships in giving full support to the State Department draft resolution authorizing the United States to violate international law by detaining and inspecting vessels, aircraft, and other means of conveyance moving to and from the Republic of Guatemala so as to block arms shipments for defense of Guatemala from the impending U.S. attack and travel by agents of international communism. By aligning itself unequivocally with the United States, fostering foreign investment, guaranteeing the domestic predominance of business interests, and maintaining a basis for repression of labor and political dissidents, the democratic government satisfied the basic conditions demanded by the United States. Correspondingly, it has received a measure of U.S. support. Thus, in 1955, when a small force of Costa Ricans attacked a border area from Nicaragua, Figueres suspended individual rights and constitutional guarantees and repelled the incursion with U.S. aid, thus not forfeiting his democratic credentials by the repressive measures he instituted, permitted for U.S. clients. Nevertheless, concerns over Costa Rica did not abate. State Department intelligence warned in 1953 that Figueres had turned his country into a haven for exiles from the dictatorships and was toying with ideas about a broad program of economic development and firmer control over foreign investment. He hoped to finance development preferably by domestic capital and does not look with favor upon capital organized beyond the individual or family level. Large private corporations such as those in the United States are an anathema in his opinion. He also sought to increase the bargaining power of the small, undeveloped countries vis-a-vis the large manufacturing nations. He was dangerous, Lefebvre comments, because he hoped to use government powers to free Costa Rica's internal development as much as possible from foreign control, thus undermining the good neighbor policy's assumption that Latin America could be kept in line merely through economic pressure. The U.S. government was particularly concerned that the Costa Rican Constitution, while outlawing communism, still provided libertarian guarantees that impeded the kind of persecution of dissidents that is mandatory in a well-functioning democracy. And despite Don Pepe's cooperation with U.S. corporations and the CIA support for U.S. interventions in the region and general loyalty to the United States over the years, he has continued to exhibit an unacceptable degree of independence, so much so that the leading representative of capitalist democracy in Central America must be excluded from the media, as we have seen. If the enemies of democracy are not communists, quote unquote, then they are terrorists. Still better, communist terrorists or terrorists supported by international communism. The rise and decline of international terrorism in the 1980s provides much insight into the utility of interpretations, quote unquote. When Ronald Reagan and George Shultz called the evil scourge of terrorism a plague spread by depraved opponents of civilization itself, in a return to barbarism in the modern age, was placed on the agenda of concern by the Reagan administration. From its first days, the administration proclaimed that international terrorism would replace Carter's human rights crusade as the soul of our foreign policy. The Reaganites would dedicate themselves to the defense of a civilized world against the program of international terrorism outlined most prominently in Claire Sterling's influential book, The Terror Network. Here, the Soviet Union was identified as the source of the plague and the endorsement of a new scholarly discipline, whose practitioners were particularly impressed with Sterling's major insight, which provides an irrefutable proof of Soviet guilt. The clinching evidence, as Walter Laqueur phrased it in a review of Sterling's book, is that terrorism occurs almost exclusively in democratic or relatively democratic countries. By 1985, terrorism in the Middle East Mediterranean region was selected as the top story of the year in an Associated Press poll of editors and broadcasters, and concern reached fever pitch in subsequent months. The U.S. bombing of Libya in 1986 April largely tamed the monster, and in the following years the plague subsided to more manageable proportions as the Soviet Union and its clients retreated in the face of American courage and determination, according to the preferred account. The rise and decline of the plague had little relation to anything happening in the world, with no exception. The rise coincided with the need to mobilize the U.S. population to support the Reaganite commitment to state power and violence, and its decline with rising concern over the need to face the costs of Reaganite military Keynesian excesses with their technique of writing hot checks for $200 billion a year to create an illusion of prosperity. The vice presidential candidate Lloyd Bentsen phrased the perception of conservative business elements at the 1988 Democratic Convention. The public relations apparatus, surely the most sophisticated component of the Reagan administration, was faced with a dual problem in 1981: to frighten the domestic enemy, the general population at home, sufficiently so that they could bear the costs of programs to which they were opposed, while avoiding direct confrontations with the evil empire itself, as far too dangerous for us. The solution to the dilemmas was to concoct an array of little Satans, tentacles of the great Satan poised to destroy us, but weak and defenseless so that they could be attacked with impunity. In short, the Kremlin directed international terrorism. The farce proceeded perfectly with the cooperation of the casuists, whose task was to give proper interpretation of the term terrorism, protecting the doctrine that its victims are primarily the democratic countries of the West. To conduct this campaign of ideological warfare successfully, it was necessary to obscure the central role of the United States in organizing and directing state terror, and to conceal its extensive involvement in international terrorism in earlier years, as in the attack against Cuba, the prime example of the evil scourge of terrorism from the early 1960s. Some historical engineering was also required with respect to terrorism in the Middle East, Mediterranean region, the primary focus of concern within the propaganda operations. Here it was necessary to suppress the role of the United States and its Israeli clients. These tasks have been well within the capacity of the media and the terrorologists. The U.S. role is easily excised. After all, the phrase United States terrorism is an oxymoron on par with thunderous silence or United States aggression. Israeli state terrorism escapes under the same literary convention, Israel being a client state, though it is recognized that there were Jewish terrorists in a distant and forgotten past. This fact can be placed in proper perspective by following the suggestion of the editor of a collection of scholarly essays who invokes the plausible distinction between morally unacceptable terrorist attacks on civilians and more ambiguous attacks on agents of authority and persecution. We would therefore distinguish sharply between Urgun Zvai Lumi's attack on British soldiers and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine's violence against airline passengers traveling to Israel. One can imagine a different formulation, for example, a sharp distinction between the attacks against Israeli and U.S. soldiers by Arabs who are termed terrorists and the many murderous attacks on Arab civilians by the Urgun Zvailumi and the Israeli army in later years. But that would hardly create a proper image for a sound and sober analysis of the consequences of political violence. The greatest significance of international terrorism as an ideological instrument is illustrated by the reaction when someone breaks ranks and documents the part that the United States and its clients have played in conducting, organizing, and supporting international terrorism. If such work cannot be simply ignored, it elicits virtual frenzy, deranged, absurd, and fantasies that are some phrases drawn from the 1988 commentary, unaccompanied by even a semblance of an argument. Such reactions are not without interest and merit some thought. There are three positions that one might take with regard to terrorism. We can attribute it to official enemies, whatever the facts. We can dismiss the entire discussion of terrorism as ideologic motivated nonsense, not worthy of attention. We can take the phenomenon seriously, agree that terrorism warrants concern and condemnation, investigate it, and let the chips fall where they may. On rational assumptions, we dismiss the first and accept the third. The second position is at least arguable, though in my judgment wrong. I think there is every reason to take terrorism seriously, and the concept is as clear as most that enter into political discourse. But considerations of rationality are not pertinent. The first and wholly irrational position is the standard one in the media and the literature of terrorology, overwhelmingly dominant. The second position is regarded as more or less tolerable, since it absolves the United States and its clients from blame, apart from their attempt at ideologic manipulation. The third position, in contrast, is utterly beyond the pale, for when we pursue it, we quickly reach entirely unacceptable conclusions, discovering, for example, that Miami and Washington have been among the major world centers of international terrorism from the Kennedy period until today. Under any definition of terrorism, whether that of the United States Code, international conventions, military manuals, or whatever. A variant of the first position, still tolerable, though less than in its pure form, is to argue that it is unfair to condemn Palestinians, Lebanese kidnappers, etc., without considering the factors that led them to these crimes. Their position has the merit of tacitly accepting, hence reinforcing the approved premises as to the origins of the plague. The second position can be made still more palatable by restricting it to psychocultural analysis of the Western obsession with terrorism, avoiding the institutional factors that led to the choice of this marvelously successful public relations device in the 1980s. An analysis of such institutional factors readily discernible can be dismissed with the label conspiracy theory, another familiar reflex when it is necessary to prevent thought and protect institutions from scrutiny. The idea that talk of terrorism is mere confusion provides a useful fallback position in case the role of the United States is exposed. One can, in short, adopt this device to dismiss those who pursue the unacceptable third option of hopeless fanatics and conspiracy theorists, and then return to the favored first position of the interpretation of ongoing events. The first position, simple and unsubtle, completely dominates public discussion, the media, and what is regarded as the scholarly literature. Its dominance and utility are obvious at every turn. To select an example from late 1988, consider the refusal of the State Department to permit Yasser Arafat to address the United Nations in November. The official grounds were that his visit posed a threat to U.S. security, but no one pretended to take that seriously. Even George Shultz did not believe Arafat's bodyguards were going to hijack a taxi in New York or take over the Pentagon. It is perhaps of some interest that no one cared that the official rationale was unworthy of even of refutation, But let us put that aside. What must be taken seriously was what was taken seriously was the story that accompanied the spurious reasons offered that Arafat was not permitted to set foot on U.S. soil because of the abhorrence for terrorism on the part of the organizers and supporters of the Contra War, government-run death squads in El Salvador and Guatemala, the bombing of Tripoli, and other notable exercises in violence, all of which qualify as international terrorism, or worse, if we are willing to adopt the third position on the matter of terrorism, that is, the position that is honest, rational, and hence utterly unthinkable. At the invitation up to Arafat, as the invitation to Arafat was being considered, Senator Christopher Dodd warned that if Arafat were permitted to address the General Assembly, Congress would cut off U.S. funding for the United Nations. I think you can't underestimate the strong feeling in this country about terrorism. Dodd informed the press, the leading Dodd has ample knowledge of Central America and the agency of terror there. Explaining Schultz's no to Arafat, the front page New York Times headline reads, "Personal disgust for terrorism as at the root of Secretary's decision to rebuff the PLO." This article took on to describe Schultz's visceral contempt for terrorism. Times Washington correspondent R.W. Apple added that Mr. Schultz has waged something of a personal crusade against terrorists, which has always mattered so intensely to Mr. Schultz. The press, television, and radio either expressed their admiration for Schultz for taking such a forthright stand against the plague of terrorism, or criticized him for allowing his understandable and meritorious rage to overcome his statesman-like reserve. The news reports and commentary did not call upon witnesses from Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala, Angola, southern Lebanon, Gaza, and elsewhere to share their insights into Schultz's visceral contempt for terrorism and the strong feelings in Congress about the resort to violence. Rather, the media warned soberly that Yasser Arafat is not your ordinary political controversial visa applicant. His group kills people. Arafat is thus quite unlike Adolfo Calero, Jose Napoleon Duarte, and his cohorts, or Yitzhak Shamir, among the many leaders whom we welcome from abroad, because one must assume they do not, quote unquote, kill people. Those who might have expected the media to take the occasion to review George Shultz's record of advocacy and support for terrorism, perhaps raising the question of whether there might be a note of hypocrisy in his personal statement or the media interpretation of it, would have been sorely disappointed. As in totalitarian states, however, cartoonists had greater latitude and were able to depict the leaders who Schultz may have had in mind when he lamented that people are forgetting what a threat international terrorism is. Francis Mitterrand, who forgot when we sank the Greenpeace ship, Britain's Thatcher, who forgot when we had those IRA blokes shot at Gibraltar, the USSR's Gorbachev, who forgot how we mine-bombed all those children in Afghanistan, and the United States Schultz, who forgot about all the civilians, our friends the Contras, murdered in Nicaragua. Other examples can readily be added. That Arafat and the PLO have engaged in terrorist acts is not in doubt, nor is it in doubt that they are minor actors in the arena of international terrorism. One of the acts of PLO terror that most outraged the Secretary of State and his admirers in Congress and the media was the hijacking of the Achilles Lauro and the murder of Leon Klinghoffer, doubtless a vile terrorist act. Their sensibilities were not aroused, however, by the Israeli bombing of Tunis a week earlier, killing 20 Tunisians and 55 Palestinians with smart bombs that tore people with shreds beyond recognition, among other horrors described by Israeli journalist Eman Kapulak on the scene. U.S. journals had little interest, the victims being Arabs and the killers U.S. clients. Secretary Schultz was definitely interested, however. The United States had cooperated in the massacre by refusing to warn its ally, Tunisia, that the bombers were on their way, and Schultz telephoned Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, a noted terrorist himself, from the early 1940s to inform him that the U.S. administration had considerable sympathy for the Israeli action, the press reported. Schultz drew back from this public approbation when the UN Security Council unanimously denounced the bombing as an act of armed aggression. The United States abstained. Foreign Minister Shimon Peres was welcomed to Washington a few days later as a man of peace, while the press solemnly discussed his consultations with President Reagan on the evil scourge of terrorism and what can be done to counter it. The outrage over hijacking does not extend to Israeli hijackings that have been carried out in international waters for many years, including civilian ferries traveling from Cyprus to Lebanon, with large numbers of people kidnapped, over 100 kept in Israeli prisons without trial, and many killed, some by Israeli gunners, while they tried to stay afloat after their ship was sunk, according to survivors interviewed in prison. The strong feelings of Congress and the media were also not aroused by the case of Noam and Fatir, deported from the West Bank in July 1987. After serving 18 months in prison on the charge of membership in a bad organization, he was released and returned to his home in Nablus. Shortly after, the government ordered him deported. When he appeared to the courts, the prosecutor argued that the deportation was legitimate because he had entered the country illegally, having been kidnapped by the Israeli Navy while traveling from Lebanon to Cyprus on the ship Hamdallah in July 1985. The High Court accepted his elegant reasoning as valid. The visceral outrage over terrorism is restricted to worthy victims, meeting a criteria that is all too obvious. The hijacking of the Achille Laura was in retaliation for the bombing of Tunis, but the West properly dismissed this justification for a terrorist act. The bombing of Tunis, in turn, was in retaliation for terrorist murder of 3 Israelis in Cyprus by a group which, as Israeli conceded, had probable connections to Damascus but none to Tunis, which was selected as a target rather than Damascus because it was defenseless. The Reagan administration selected Libyan cities as a bombing target a few months later, in part for the same reason. The bombing of Tunis, with its many civilian casualties, was described by Secretary of State Schultz as a legitimate response to terrorist attacks to general approbation. The terrorist murderers in Cyprus were, in turn, justified by their perpetrators as retaliation for the Israeli hijackings over the preceding decade. Had this plea even been heard, it would have been dismissed with scorn. The term retaliation, too, must be given an appropriate interpretation, as any causist would understand. The same is true of other terms, for example, the notion of preventing or reducing violence. A report headline, Palestinian casualties nearly double, opens by quoting the Israeli Army Chief of Staff, who says the number of Palestinians wounded in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip has almost doubled in recent weeks, but that the army has failed to reduce violence in the occupied areas. This statement makes no sense, but a look at the background allows it to be decoded. Shortly before Minister of Defense Yitzhak Rabin had authorized the use of plastic bullets, stating that more casualties is precisely our aim. Our purpose is to increase the number of wounded among those who take part in violent activities. He also explained the notion of violent activities. We want to get rid of the illusion that some people in remote villages that they have liberated themselves, he said, explaining that army raids make it clear to them where they live and within which framework. Palestinians must understand, quote unquote, the solution can be achieved only by peaceful means, not by illusions of self-government. The army is therefore stepping up raids on remote villages that have declared themselves liberated zones, with a resulting increase in injuries. The report continues. In a typical example, Israeli troops raided more than a dozen West Bank villages and wounded 22 Palestinians yesterday. An army spokeswoman explained that a strike had been called and the army wanted to prevent violence by an increased presence and by making more arrests. We can now return to the original newspeak. The number of Palestinians wounded in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip has almost doubled in recent weeks, but that the army has failed to reduce violence in the occupied areas. Translating into intelligible English, The army has doubled the violence in the occupied territories by aggressive actions with the specific intent of increasing casualties and by expanding its violent attacks to remote and peaceful villages that were attempting to run their own affairs. But it has so far failed to rid the people of illusions of self-government. For the for the Israeli authorities and the US media, an attempt by villagers to run their own affairs is quote unquote violence, and a brutal attack to teach them who rules is quote unquote preventing violence. Orwell would have been impressed. A report a few days later, headline Israelis killed 3 in West Bank. Gaza clashes described how soldiers shot and wounded 3 Palestinians in a remote town, rarely visited by soldiers and generally ignored by the military. Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin said 2 weeks ago the army would step up its action in such villages to remind the inhabitants where they lived and who is in control. This was one of 30 villages raided in an offensive aimed at preventing violence, the report continues. And one can see the point. After the Israeli soldiers shot 3 Palestinians in the village in their offensives aimed at preventing violence, angry residents later stoned vehicles in the area. An accompanying story is devoted to the question of whether the PLO will really renounce terror, quoting officials from Rabin's Labor Party and others in disbelief. With appropriate interpretations, then, we can rest content that the United States and its clients defend democracy, social reform, and self-determination against communism, terrorists, and violent elements of all kinds. It is the responsibility of the media to laud the quote-unquote Democrats and demonize the official enemy, the Sandinistas, the PLO, or whoever gets in the way. On occasion, this requires some fancy footwork, but the challenge has generally been successfully met. Our yearning for democracy is accompanied by a no less profound yearning for peace, and the media also face the task of historical engineering to establish this required truth. We therefore have phenomena called peace missions and the peace process or advocating at some moment. In the media or responsible scholarship, one will therefore find no such statement as the United States opposes the peace process or Washington has been induced to join the peace process. The reason is that such statements would be logical contradictions. Through the years when the United States was trumping the Contadora process, undermining the Central American peace accords, and deflecting the threat of peace in the Middle East, it never opposed the peace process in acceptable commentary, but always supported the peace process and tried to advance it. One might imagine that even a great power that is sublime beyond imagination might sometimes be standing in the way of some peace process, perhaps because of misunderstanding or faulty judgment. Not so the United States, however, by definition. A headline in the Los Angeles Times in late January 1988 reads, Latin peace trip by Schultz planned. This subheading describes the contents of the peace trip. Mission would be last-ditch effort to diffuse opposition on Contra aid. The article quotes administration officials who described the peace mission as the only way to save Contra aid in the face of growing congressional opposition. In plain English, the peace mission was a last-ditch effort to block peace and mobilize Congress for the unlawful use of force now that Washington and its loyal media had succeeded in completely dismantling the unwanted Central American peace plan, and Ortega had agreed that its provisions should apply to Nicaragua alone, foiling the hope that Nicaragua would reject these U.S. conditions so that they could be depicted as the spoilers. A further goal of the peace mission, the article continues, was to relegate Nicaragua's 4 democratic neighbors to the sidelines in peace talks, with the United States taking command. The democracies, though pliable, still show an annoying streak of independence. A few months later, the New York Times reported further efforts by the administration to keep pressure on the Sandinistas by continuing to provide support for the Contras, including more military aid, while urging U.S. allies to join the United States in efforts to isolate Nicaragua diplomatically and revise the peace process. George Shultz is quoted as reflecting that perhaps he might have become involved in the peace process still earlier. The Los Angeles Times described these renewed administration efforts to build support for the resumption of U.S. military aid to Nicaraguan Contras under the headline, Schultz will try to revive Latin peace process. In short, war is peace. The task of historical engineering has been accomplished with no less efficiency in the case of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The problem has been to present the United States and Israel as yearning for peace and pursuing the peace process, while in fact, since the early 1970s, they have led the rejectionist camp and have been blocking peace initiatives that have been broad international and regional support. The technique has been the usual one. The peace process is, by definition, whatever the United States proposes. The desired conclusions now follow, however, the facts. U.S. policy is also, by definition, moderate, so that those who oppose it are extremist and uncompromising. History has been stood on its head in a most intriguing manner, as I have documented elsewhere. These are actually two factors that operate to yield remarkable distortion of the record concerning peace, terrorism, and related matters in the Middle East. One is the societal function of the media in serving U.S. elite interests. The other, the special protection afforded Israel, since it became the symbol of human decency by virtue of its smashing military victory in 1967, that established it as the worthy strategic asset. The interplay of these factors has led to some departure from the usual media pattern. Typically, as discussed throughout, the media encourage debate over tactical issues with the general framework of the elite consensus concerning the goals and strategy. In the cases of the Arab-Israeli conflict, however, the spectrum has been even narrower. Substantial segments of elite opinion, including major corporations with Middle East interests, have joined most of the world in favor of the political settlement that the United States and Israel have been able to block for many years. But their position has largely been excluded from the media, which have adhered to the consensus of Israel's two major political groupings, generally taking Labor Party rejectionism to represent the peace option. A problem develops when U.S. and Israeli positions diverge. One such case arose in 1977 October, when a Soviet-American statement was issued calling for termination of the state of war and establishment of normal peace relations because Israel and its neighbors, as well as for internationally guaranteed borders and demilitarized zone. The statement was endorsed by the PLO but bitterly denounced by Israel's and its domestic U.S. lobby. The media reaction was instructive. The media normally adopt the stand of their leader in the White House in the event of conflict with some foreign state. The administration is allowed to frame the issues and is given the most prominent coverage, with its adversaries sometimes permitted in a line here and there in rebuttal in the interest of objectivity and fairness. In this case, however, the pattern was reversed. As described in Montag Kern's detailed analysis of TV coverage, the media highlighted the Israeli position, treating the Carter administration in the manner of some official enemy. Israeli premises framed the issues, and Israeli sources generally dominated coverage and interpretation. Arab sources, in particular the PLO, were largely dismissed or treated with contempt. Israel was able to make its case on television. Kern concludes, while this is not for the U.S. administration, which trailed the Israelis in terms of all the indicators of media access and influence, Carter soon backed down. With the threat of peaceful settlement deflected, the peace process could resume on its rejectionist course. Nevertheless, the media are but bitterly condemned as pro-PLO and is imposing an unfair double standard on Israel. We then debate the sources of this strange malady. As in other cases, attack is the best defense, particularly when dominance over the media and exclusion of contrary views has reached a sufficient level so that any criticism, however outlandish, will be treated with respect. Reinhold Niebuhr once remarked that perhaps the most significant moral characteristic of a nation is its hypocrisy. The point is well taken. There is a simple measure of hypocrisy which we properly apply to our enemies. When peace groups, government figures, media, and loyal intellectuals in the Soviet sphere deplore brutal and repressive acts by the United States and its clients, we test their sincerity by asking what they say about their own responsibilities. Upon ascertaining the answer, we dismiss their condemnations, however accurate, as the sheerest hypocrisy. Minimal honesty requires that we apply the same standards to ourselves. Freedom of the press, for example, is a prime concern for the media and the intellectual community. The major issue of freedom of the press in the 1980s has surely been the harassment of La Prensa in Nicaragua. Coverage of its tribulations probably exceeds all other reporting and commentary on freedom of the press throughout the world combined and is unique in the passion of rhetoric. No crime of the Sandinistas has elicited more outrage than their censorship of La Prensa and suspension in 1986, immediately after the congressional vote of $100 million for the Contras, a vote that amounted to a virtual declaration of war by the United States, as the Reaganites happily proclaimed, and a sharp rebuff to the World Court. La Prensa publisher Violeta Chamorro was at once given an award by the Newman Journalist Foundation at Harvard for her courageous battle for freedom of speech. In the New York Review of Books, Murray Kempton appealed to all those committed to free expression to provide financial aid for the brave struggle of the owners and editors to maintain their staff and equipment. Such gifts would supplement the funding provided by the U.S. government, which began shortly after the Sandinista victory, when President Carter authorized the CIA to support La Prensa and the anti-Sandinista opposition. Under the heading A Newspaper of Valor, the Washington Post lauded Violeta Chamorro, commenting that she and her newspaper deserved 10 awards. Other media commentary had been abundant and no less effusive, while the Sandinistas have been bitterly condemned for harassing or silencing the tribunal of the people. We now ask whether these sentiments reflect libertarian values or service to power, applying the standard test of sincerity. How, for example, did the same period and institutions react when the security forces of Duarte government that we support eliminated the independent media in the U.S. client state of El Salvador, not by intermittent censorship and suspension, but by murder, mutilation, and physical destruction, question mark? We have already seen the answer. There was silence. The New York Times had nothing to say about these atrocities in the news columns or editorials then or since, and others who profess their indignation over the treatment of La Prensa are no different. This extreme contempt for freedom of the press remains in force as we applaud our achievements in bringing quote-unquote democracy to El Salvador. We conclude that among the articulate intellectuals, those who believe in freedom of the press could easily fit in someone's living room and would include a few of those who proclaim libertarian values while assailing the enemy of the state. To test this in conclusion further, we may turn to Guatemala. No censorship was required in Guatemala while the United States was supporting the terror at its height. The murder of dozens of journalists sufficed. There was little notice in the United States. With the democratic renewal that we proudly hail, there was some halting efforts to explore the political space that perhaps had opened. In February 1988, two journalists who had returned from the exile opened the center-left weekly La Época, testing Guatemalan democracy. A communique of the secret anti-communist army had warned returning journalists, "We will make sure they either leave the country or die inside of it." No notice was taken in the United States. In April, great indignation was aroused when La Prensa could not publish during a newsprint shortage. For the Washington Post, this was another pointed lesson in arbitrary power. By denying La Prensa the newsprint, there were renewed cries of outrage when La Prensa was suspended for 2 weeks in July after what the government alleged to be fabricated and inflammatory counts of violence that had erupted at demonstrations. Meanwhile, on June 10, 15 heavily armed men broke into the offices of La Época, stole valuable equipment, and firebombed the offices, destroying them. They also kidnapped the night watchman, releasing him under the threat of death if he were to speak about the attack. Eyewitness testimony and other sources left little doubt that it was operation of the security forces. The editor held a press conference on June 14th to announce that the journal would shut down because there are not conditions in the country to guarantee the exercise of free and independent journalism. After a circular appeared threatening traitor journalists, including communists and those who have returned from exile, warning that to flee the country or find themselves dead within, he returned to exile, accompanied to the airport by a Western diplomat. Another journalist also left. The destruction of La Epoca signaled not only the end of an independent media voice in Guatemala, but it served as a warning as well that future press independence would not be tolerated by the government security forces, America's Watch commented. These events elicited no public response from the guardians of free expression. The facts were not even reported in the New York Times or Washington Post, though not from ignorance, surely. It simply was that the violent destruction of independent media is not important when it takes place in a fledgling democracy backed by the United States. There was, however, a congressional reaction. NACLA reported. In Washington, liberal Democratic senators responded by adding $4 million to the administration's request for military aid, with Senator Inouye leading the way. These erstwhile freedom of the press junkies have offered a brass $9 million plus some $137 million in economic aid, including $80 million cash, much of which goes to swell the Army's coffers, while La Epoca editor Byron Barrera is back in Mexico and Guatemala's press is again confined to right-wing muckraking and army propaganda. The vigilant guardians of freedom of the press observed in silence. A few weeks later, Israeli security forces raided the office of the leading Jerusalem ally, El Fahar, arresting its managing editor, Haram Abdelkader, and jailing him for 6 months without trial on unspecified security grounds. There were no ringing editorial denunciations calling for redistribution of these trivialities were not even reported in the New York Times or Washington Post. Unlike Violeta Chamorro, to whom nothing of the sort had happened, Abdelkader does not deserve 10 awards, or even one, or even a line. Once again, the facts are clear. The alleged concern for freedom of the press in Nicaragua is sheer fraud. Perhaps one might argue that censorship of La Prensa is more important than the murder of an editor by U.S.-backed security forces and the destruction of offices by the army of its terrorist squads, because La Prensa is a journal of such significance, having courageously opposed our ally Somoza under the leadership of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, assassinated by the dictator in 1978. That would be a poor argument at best. Freedom of the press means little if it only serves powerful institutions, but there are further flaws. One is that the post-1980 La Prensa bears virtually no relation to the journal that opposed Somoza. After the murder of Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, his brother Xavier became editor and remained so until the owners ousted him in 1980. 80% of the staff left with him and founded El Nuevo Diario, which is the successor to the old La Prensa, if we consider a journal to be constituted of its editor and staff, not its owners and equipment. The new editor of La Prensa, son of the assassinated editor, had previously been selling advertising. Later, he joined the CIA-run Contra Directorate, remaining co-editor of the journal, which publicly supports his stand. These facts are not to be found in the media tributes to the brave tradition of La Prensa. They are either unmentioned in the course of lamentations over the fate of this newspaper of valor, or treated in the style of Stephen Kinzer, who writes that El Nuevo Diario was founded by a breakaway group of employees of La Prensa, sympathetic to the Sandinista cause, a breakaway group that included 80% of the staff of the editor, who opposed the new line of CIA-supported journal. The extent of the hypocrisy becomes still more obvious when we consider the newspaper of valor more closely. The journal has quite openly supported the attack against Nicaragua. In April 1986, as the campaign to provide military aid to the Contras was heating up, one of the owners, Jamie Chamorro, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post calling for aid to those Nicaraguans who are fighting for democracy, the standard reference to U.S. proxy forces. In the weeks preceding the summer congressional vote A host of articles by different La Prensa staff members denounced the Sandinistas in major newspapers throughout the United States. John Spicer Nicholas observes, through a series of op-eds signed by La Prensa editors in the Washington Post as they traveled to the United States under the auspices of front organizations in the North Contra funding network. Under its new regime, La Prensa has barely pretended to be a newspaper. Rather, it is a propaganda journal devoted to undermining the government and supporting the attack against Nicaragua by a foreign power. Since its opening in October 1987, the communists are quite open and transparent. To my knowledge, there is no precedent for the survival and continued publication of such a journal during the period of crisis in any Western democracy, surely not the United States. Advocates of the libertarian values should nonetheless insist that Nicaragua break precedent in this area, despite its dire straits, and deplore its failure to do so. As already mentioned, however, the advocates are not easy to discover, as the most elementary test of sincerity demonstrates. It could be argued that comparison with the United States is inadequate, given the dismal U.S. record. We might take that to be the import of remarks by Supreme Court Justice William Brennan in a speech delivered at Hebrew University Law School in December 1987, where he observed that the United States has a long history of failing to preserve civil liberties when it perceived its national security threatened, as during World War I, when there was not even a remote threat. It may well be Israel, not the United States, that provides the best hope for building a jurisprudence that can protect civil liberties against the demands of national security. Brennan said, adding that the nations of the world, faced with sudden threats to their own security, will look to Israel's experience in handling its continuing security crisis and may well find in that experience the expertise to reject the security claims that Israel has exposed as baseless, and the courage to preserve the civil liberties that Israel has preserved without detriment to its security. If we can draw lessons from Israel's stellar record, adversity may yet be the handmaiden of liberty. Following the precepts of the characteristic accolade to the symbol of human decency, and not coincidentally, loyal U.S. ally and client, we derive a further test of sincerity of those who denounce the totalitarian Sandinistas for their treatment of La Prensa and the political opposition. Let us proceed to apply it. Just at the time that La Prensa was suspended in 1986, after the virtual U.S. declaration of war against Nicaragua, Israel permanently closed two Jerusalem newspapers, Al-Matik and Al-Ahad, on the grounds that although we offer them freedom of expression, it is forbidden to permit them to exploit this freedom in order to harm the state of Israel. The Interior Ministry declared that if it was compelled to act in the interest of state security and public welfare, we believe in freedom of the press, the ministry asserted, but one has to properly balance freedom of expression and the welfare of the state. The closure was upheld by the High Court on the ground that it is inconceivable that the state of Israel should allow terrorist organizations which seek to destroy it to set up business in its territory. Legitimate as they may be, the government had accused these two Arab newspapers of receiving support from hostile groups. To my knowledge, the only mention of these facts in a U.S. newspaper was in a letter of mine to the Boston Globe. As La Prensa was reopened in 1987, the Israeli press reported on the closing of Nazareth political journal within Israel proper on the grounds of its extreme nationalist editorial line, and an Arab-owned news office in Nablus was shut down for 2 years. Its owner had by then been imprisoned for 6 months without trial on the charge of membership in an illegal organization, and a military communist stated that his wife had maintained the ties of the office to the PLO. Such repressive actions are quote-unquote legal under the state of emergency that has been enforced since the state was founded in 1948. The High Court upheld the closing of the Nazareth Journal, alleging that the security services had provided evidence of a connection between the journal and terrorist organization, and dismissing as irrelevant the plea of its publisher that everything that had appeared in the journal had passed through Israeli censorship. None of this appears to have been reported here. New York Times correspondent Thomas Friedman chose the day of the closing of the Nablus office to produce one of his regular odes to freedom of expression in Israel. There was no outcry of protest among American civil libertarians, no denunciation or even comment on acts that far exceed the harassment and temporary suspension of U.S.-funded journal in Nicaragua that openly supports the overthrow of the government, no call for organizing a terrorist army to enforce our high standards, so grievously offended. Silence continued to reign as the Nazareth Weekly Al Raya was closed by order of the Ministry of the Interior after its editor had been jailed for 3 months without trial. Once again, history has devised a control experiment to demonstrate utter contempt for freedom of speech on the part of the professed civil libertarians. Critic of Nicaraguan abuses of the press freedom who passed the most elementary test of sincerity could fit into a very small living room, indeed, perhaps even a telephone booth. As for the jurisprudence that so impressed Justice Brennan, the Hebrew press observed that Israeli journalism lacks any guarantees, even the slightest, for its freedom. The state is armed with weapons that have no parallel in any democratic society in the world, deriving from colonial British regulations that were reinstituted by Israel as soon as the state was established. These draconian regulations include measures to forbid and punish publications that might encourage disobedience or displeasure among the inhabitants of the country or unpleasantness to the authorities. The law authorizes the Interior Ministry to terminate the appearance of a journal for any period that he will deem appropriate if it has published lies or false rumors that are likely, in his opinion, to enhance panic or despair. The measures are held in reserve, sometimes applied, and they contribute to fear and an atmosphere of McCarthyism that enhances the self-censorship normally practiced by editors. This voluntary self-censorship, Israeli legal analyst Moshe Negbi writes, adds substantially to the effects of the rich and unusual array of tools for crushing press freedom in the hands of the government. The censor has the legal authority to forbid any information which might, in his view, harm the defense of the country, public safety, or public order. The military censor is immune to public scrutiny, and the law forbids the press from publishing any hint that the censor ordered any changes, additions, or deletions, though often the fact is obvious, as when the lead editorial is blanked out in Israel's most respected newspaper, Haaretz. The censor has also the authority to punish without trial any newspaper he deems to have violated his orders. The Declaration of Independence of 1948, which expressed Israel's obligation with regard to the freedom and civil rights, makes no mention of freedom of expression. Negbi continues, adding that it was not an accidental omission, but rather reflected the attitudes of Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who vigorously opposed reference to these rights, adhering along with his associates to Leninist doctrine that the state should suffer no criticism for actions it regards as right. The state is even authorized to refuse to register to a journal so that it cannot be published, or to terminate it without providing any motivation for its refusal. The authority is used, for example, in barring an Arabic language social and political journal in Israel, edited by Israeli Arab lecturer at the Hebrew University in 1982, a decision approved by the High Court for unstated security reasons, or the arrest of an Arab from Nazareth a few months later for publishing a newspaper without permission, namely 4 informational leaflets. The report offers no protection when the state produces a magic word, security. While Arab citizens are the usual targets, Jews are not immune to these principles of jurisprudence. When the dovish progressive list, one of whose leaders is General Mati Peled, retired, sought to broadcast a campaign advertisement showing an interview with Arafat announcing that he accepts UN Resolution 242 and 338, High Court Justice Goldberg ruled it illegally, stating that from time to time when the government declared that the PLO is a terrorist organization, television is permitted to produce only broadcasts that to conform to this declaration and present the PLO in a negative manner as a terrorist organization. It is forbidden to broadcast anything that contradicts the declaration and presents the PLO as a political organization. Commenting attorney Avigdor Feldman writes, the logic is ironclad. State television, there is no other, is not permitted to broadcast a reality inconsistent with government decision, and if the facts are not consistent with the government stand, then not in our school, please. In the United States, one will discover very little reference to the severe constraints on free expression in Israel over many years. It was not until the violent reaction to the Palestinian uprising from December 1987 that even cursory notice was taken of these practices. In the New York Times, there has been virtually nothing. It requires considerable audacity for former chief editor A.M. Rosenthal to assert in May 1988 that censorship in Israel deserves and gets Western criticism. Furthermore, the rare exceptions do not lead to condemnation for these departures from our high ideals or a call for some action on the part of Israel's leading patron. The reaction of the U.S. media and the American intellectual community to Israeli law and practices provides further dramatic evidence that the show of concern for civil liberties and human rights in Nicaragua is cynical pretense serving other ends. The standard test of sincerity yields similar results wherever we turn. The conclusions are well enough documented by now in such a wide range of cases as to raise some serious questions among the people willing to consider fact and reason. The answers to these questions will not be pleasant to face, so we can be confident that the questions will not be asked. Discussing our unfree press half a century ago, John Dewey observed that criticisms of specific abuses has only limited value. The only really fundamentally approach to the problem is to inquire concerning the necessity effect of the present economic system upon the whole system of publicity, upon the judgment of what news is, upon the selection and elimination of matter that is published, upon the treatment of news in both editorial and news columns. The question under this mode of approach is not how many specific abuses there are and how they may be remedied, but how far genuine the intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible at any large scale under the existing economic regime. Publishers and editors, with their commitments to the public and social order, of which they are the beneficiaries, will often prove to be among the chief enemies of true liberty of the press. Dewey continued, it is unreasonable to expect the managers of this business enterprise to do otherwise than as leaders and henchmen of big business, and to select and treat their special wares from this standpoint. Insofar as the ideologic managers are given public what it wants, that is because of the effect of the present economic system in generating intellectual indifference and apathy, in creating a demand for distraction and diversion, and almost a love for crime, provided it pays among public, debauched by the ideal of getting away with whatever it can. To these apt reflections, we may add the intimate relations between privilege and state power, the institutionally determined need to accommodate to the interests of those who control basic social decisions, and the success of established power in steadily disintegrating any independent culture that fosters values other than greed, personal gain, and subordination to authority, and any popular structure that sustains independent thought and action. The importance of these factors is highlighted by the fact that even the formal right to freedom of speech was gained only by unremitting popular struggle that challenged existing social arrangements. With the reigning social order, the general public must remain an object of manipulation, not a participant in thought, debate, and decision. As the privileged have long understood, it is necessary to ward off recurrent crises of democracy, quote unquote. In earlier chapters, I have discussed some of the ways these principles have been expressed in the modern period, but the concepts are natural and have arisen from the very origins of the modern democratic thought. Condemning radical Democrats who had threatened to turn the world upside down during the English Revolution of the 17th century, historian Clement Walker in 1661 complained, "They have cast all the mysteries and secrets of government before the vulgar like pearls before swine, and have laughed both the soldierly and people to look so far into them as to ravel back all governments to the first principle of nature. They have made the people thereby so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil role." Walker's concerns were soon overcome, and as an orderly world was restored and the political defeat of the Democrats was total and irreversible. Christopher Hill observes by 1695, censorship could be abandoned, not on the radical libertarian principles, but because censorship was no longer necessary, for the opinion formers now censored themselves, and nothing got into print which frightened the men of the property. In the same year, John Locke wrote that day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and dairymaids, must be told what to believe. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. But at least, Hill comments, Locke did not intend that priests should do the telling that was for God himself. With the decline of religious authority in the modern period, the task has fallen to the secular priesthood, who understand their responsibility with some clarity, as already discussed. Despite these insights, some have continued to be seduced by the democratic dogmatisms that are derided by those dedicated to the art of manipulation. John Stuart Mill wrote, not the violent conflict between parts of the truth, but the quiet suppression of half of it is the formidable evil. There is always hope when people are forced to listen to both sides. Coming to the present, the Code of Professional Conduct of the British National Union of Journalists enjoins the journalist to eliminate distortion and strive to ensure that the information he or she disseminates is fair and accurate. Avoid the expression of comment and conjecture as established by fact and falsification by distortion, selection, or misrepresentation. The manipulation of the public in the 1960s elicited the concerns expressed in 1966 by Senator Fulbright, quoted earlier. A year later, Jerome Barron proposed an interpretation of the First Amendment which focuses on the ideas that restraining the hand of government is quite useless in assuring free speech if a restraint on access is effectively secured by private groups. That is, the new media of communication. Only they can lay sometimes before the public, and it is they rather than government who can most effectively abridge the expression by nullifying the opportunity for an idea to win opposition. As a constitutional theory for the communication of ideas, laissez-faire is manifestly irrelevant when the media are narrowly controlled by private power. Many viewed such ideas with alarm. The editors of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, for many years one of the more independent segments of the local quality press, agree that the newspaper has an obligation to the community in which it is published to present fairly unpopular as well as popular sides of a question. But such a dictum should not be enforced by law. As a practical matter, they held, a newspaper which consistently refuses to give expression to viewpoints with which it differs is not likely to succeed and doesn't deserve to be. The editors were wrong in their factual assessment, though their qualms about legal obligations cannot be lightly dismissed. In reality, only those media that consistently restrict both sides to narrow consensus of the powerful will succeed in the guided free market. It is particularly important to understand what stories not to seek, what sources of evidence to avoid. Refugees from Timor or from U.S. bombing in Laos and Cambodia have no useful tales to tell. It is important to stay away from camps on the Honduran border, where refugees report without exception that they were all fleeing from the army that we are supporting, and every person had a tale of atrocity by government forces, the same ones we are again outfitting with weapons as they conduct a systematic campaign of terrorism with a combination of murder, torture, rape, the burning of crops in order to create starvation conditions and vicious atrocities. The report of the congressional delegation that reached these conclusions after the first-hand investigation in early 1981 was excluded from the media, which were avoiding the primary source of evidence on rural El Salvador. It would be bad form to arouse public awareness of Nicaragua's noteworthy progress to the social sector, which is laying a solid foundation for long-term socioeconomic development, reported in 1983 by the Inter-American Development Bank, barred by U.S. pressure from contributing to these achievements. Correspondingly, it is improper to set forth the achievements of the Reagan administration in reversing these early successors to record the return of disease and malnutrition, illiteracy, and dying infants, while the country is driven to the zero grade of life to pay for the sin of independent development. In contrast, it is responsible for journalism for James Lemoyne to denounce the Sandinistas for the bitterness and apathy he finds in Managua. Those who hope to enter the system must learn that terror traceable to the PLO, Gaddafi, or Khomeini leaves worthy victims who merit compassion and concern, but those targeted by the United States and its allies do not fall within this category. Responsible journalists must understand that a grenade attack on Israeli army recruits and their families, leaving one killed and many wounded, deserves a front-page photograph of the victims and a substantial story. while a Contra attack on a passenger bus the day before, with 2 killed, 2 kidnapped, and many wounded, merits no report at all. Category by category, the same lessons hold. There is, in fact, a ready algorithm for those who wish to attain respectability and privilege. It is only necessary to bear in mind the test for sincerity already discussed and to make sure that you fail it at every turn. The same simple logic explains the characteristic performance of the independent media and the educated classes generally for reasons that are hardly obscure. I have been discussing methods of thought control and the reasons why they gain such prominence in democratic societies in which the general population cannot be driven from the political arena by force. The discussion may leave the impression that the system is all-powerful, but that is far from true. People have the capacity to resist, and sometimes do with great effect. Take the Western-backed slaughter and timor. The media suppressed the terrible events and the complicity of their own governments. But the story nevertheless did finally break through, reaching segments of the public and Congress. There was the achievement of a few dedicated young people whose names will not be known to history, as is generally true of those whose actions have improved the world. Their efforts did not bring an end to the Indonesian terror or the U.S. support for it, but they did mitigate the violence. Finally, as a result of their work, the Red Cross was allowed limited access. In this and other ways, tens of thousands of lives were saved. These are very few people who can claim to have achieved so much of human consequence. The same is true of many cases. Internal constraints within a powerful state provide a margin of survivability for its victims, of the fact that should never be forgotten. The United States is a much more civilized place than it was 25 years ago. The crisis of democracy and intellectual independence that so terrify elites have been real enough, and the effects on the society have been profound and on balance generally healthy. The impact is readily discernible over a wide range of concerns, including racism, the environment, feminism, forced intervention, and much else. And also in the media, which have allowed some opening to dissident opinion and critical reporting on recent years, considerably beyond what was unimaginable, even at the peak of ferment of the 60s, let alone before. One illustration of the improvement in the moral and cultural level is that it has become possible for the first time to confront in a serious way what has been done to Native Americans during the conquest of the continent, and many other necessary illusions were questioned and quickly crumbled upon inspection. As challenges were raised to orthodoxy and authority, small wonder that the 60s appear as a period of horror, chaos, and destructive abandon in reflections of privileged observers who are distressed, even appalled, by intellectual independence and moral integrity on the part of the young. So I'm going to take a short break. It's going to be like half a minute. Please bear with me. Glad you could join us. Okay, we're continuing on. The same developments have had their impact on state policy. There was no protest when John F. Kennedy sent the U.S. Air Force to attack the rural society of South Vietnam. 20 years later, the Reagan administration was driven underground, compelled to restore it to clandestine terror in Central America. The climate of opinion of concern had changed. Outside of elite circles, and the capacity of state to exercise violence had been correspondingly reduced. The toll of Reaganite terror was awesome. Tens of thousands of tortured and mutilated bodies, massive starvation, disease, and destruction, hundreds of thousands of miserable refugees. It would have been a great deal worse without the constraints imposed by people who had found ways to escape the system of indoctrination and the courage and honesty to act. There are no small achievements, again, on the parts of people whose names will be lost to history. There are ample opportunities to help create a more humane and decent world if we choose to act upon them. I began with the questions raised by the Brazilian bishops about the problems of democracy in the media. Perhaps I may close with my own conclusions on these matters. The professed concern for freedom of the press in the West is not very persuasive in the light of the easy dismissal of even extreme violations of the right of free expression in U.S. client states and the actual performance of the media of the United States in serving the powerful and privileged as an agency of manipulation, indoctrination, and control. A democratic communications policy, in contrast, would seek to develop means of expression and interaction that reflects the interests and concerns of the general population and to encourage their self-education and their individual and collective action. A policy conceived in these terms would be a desideration, though there are pitfalls and dangers that should not be overlooked. But the issue is largely academic. When viewed in isolation from the general social scene, the prospects for a democratic communication policy are inevitably constrained by the distribution of effective power to determine the course and functioning of major social institutions. Hence, the goal can be approached only as an integral part of the further democratization of the social order. This process, in turn, requires a democratic communications policy as a central component with an indispensable contribution to make. Serious steps towards more meaningful democracy would aim to dissolve the connection of decision-making power, which in our societies resides primarily in a state-corporate nexus. Such a conception of democracy, though so familiar from earlier years that it might even merit the much abused term conservative, is remote from those that dominate public doctrine, hardly a surprise given its threat to established privilege. Human beings are only species with a history. Whether they also have a future is not so obvious. The answer will lie in the prospects for popular movement with firm roots among all sectors of the population, dedicated to values that are suppressed or driven to the margins within the existing social and political order, community solidarity, concern for fragile environment that will have to sustain future generations' creative work under voluntary control, independent thought, and through democratic participation in varied aspects of life. So that's it. Necessary illusions, thought control in democratic societies, Noam Chomsky. The last chapter was utility of interpretations. So we came to the same conclusions. Like we said, the capitalist elite put out the agenda. The agenda is a business agenda and a racist agenda, an enslavement agenda, a murder agenda, a pillage agenda, and a torture agenda. It's a torture agenda, a murder agenda. That agenda is absorbed by the press. The free press or the U.S. press, mass media put out the articles that, promote the capitalist elite. It is deliberate lies. It is all deliberate lies. You just complete lies. Just the premises are all lies. They're all lies. It is a lie journalism. It is complete fabrication journalism, falsifications, omissions, lies. That is the journalism. We saw the murderous attempts by the U.S. government to oppress the press of all of the Nicaraguans, the El Salvadorans, the Guatemalans, the murder of the press, the bombings of the press. This reflects the U.S. interest in democracy, the fact that they murder and plant bombs and murder the journalists, torture the journalists. All of this stuff explains why the United States is a terrorist state. We also saw Israel's murder of journalists, removal of journalism. The U.S. is following right behind Israel in its colonial racist approach. It all mirrored the British, and the U.S. is following right behind with, destroying journalism, destroying free press, promoting fascism and totalitarianism, and promoting their colonial murderous regimes outside of the United States. It is a terrorist state. We saw also the Congress, the U.S. Congress, supporting all the acts against Nicaragua, against, promoting El Salvadoran money and military murder by the El Salvadoran regime, as well as Guatemala. America is a terrorist state, and its journalism is lies. It is a lie, deceptive propaganda that is meant for thought indoctrination, totalitarianism, fascism, similar to Hitler's and Stalin's media. It's deception and thought control. It is meant to keep the masses culled into a state of passivity and no intellectual, discussion. So let's finish up with our, review. Please, again, download and read the book. It is important. I went at 2 hours and 30 minutes because I had to finish the book today. But please download it. The Google Drive link will be... the Google Drive link will be in the description section of the video. We have discussed the concepts of United States propaganda, falsification, deceitful media, and fascist authoritarianism, the concepts of colonialism and the goal of the American media to hide the criminal terrorist actions of the U.S. government and their colonial ambitions, including their programs in Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia. The effectiveness of the American media is absolute. It completely removes the humanitarian and racist, murderous brutality against third world people and replaces it with a tirade of propaganda against an innocent group of leaders who are deemed as communists, authoritarians, or murderers, or as not effective business people to be manipulated by U.S. capitalist elites. For this reason, it is very important to understand the underlying motives of the U.S. media, mainly the American colonial ambitions to maintain a state of racist subjugation and to promote slavery and complete control of its fascist client states. We reviewed the next two chapters of Dr. Chomsky's book, Bounds of the Expressible and Adjuncts of Government. In Bounds of the Expressible, we begin to discern a war waged by the United States against democratic and nationalist movements in improvement in Central America. We studied the countries of El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and Guatemala. And we learned that the U.S. government promoted authoritarian regimes of murderous brutality, including El Salvador and Guatemala, as well as maintained a local oligarchy in Honduras to keep starvation conditions alive, quote unquote, for the Honduran people, while there was no mass murder campaign as there was in the other client fascist regimes. In El Salvador, the media heaped praise on the sadistic, bestial butcher of General Jose Napoleon Duarte, who was a mass murderer and torturer of his people. The U.S. terrorists of Congress endorsed Mr. Duarte's actions and hid his criminal, murderous brutality against his people for the sake of maintaining a subservient client regime. Similarly, in Guatemala, the U.S. terrorists of Congress funded lavishly the highly repressive regimes of Castillo Armas and brutality against the Guatemalan people, who were basically genocided by the butchers of Washington. Finally, Nicaragua, the U.S. terrorist Congress, and its media propagandists of the New York Times, Washington Post, Time Magazine, Newsweek, and Reader's Digest all maintained the congressional requirements of deceitful lies and painted the Sandinistas as a brutal regime of murder and torture and sought to overthrow them through the American terrorists of the Contras. They wrote letters to Daniel Ortega indicating that if he dare act in self-defense against the Contras, the U.S. was free to invade Nicaragua, as well as increase funding for the American terrorist organization of the Contras. The racists of Congress included Democrats of Kennedy and Sanford and several others who threatened Nicaragua with military action should they defend themselves from Reagan's overthrow of the Sandinistas. As usual, America serves as a terrorist state of colonialism and enslavement and not a democratic promoter of third world progress. As the Sandinistas were trying to improve medical care, social programs for the people, food distribution, and agribusiness were more equalized, and landholding equality was being attempted. The rot would spread according to the racist Congress, and Jimmy Carter, to mention one president, and hence Nicaragua, had to be terrorized by the American machine gun government. So we strongly advise you to download and read the book of Necessary Illusions to really understand the deceptive and subconscious indoctrination that is done by the U.S. government in their pursuit of colonialism and racist oppression and subjugation. So again, join me tomorrow for Masters of War, U.S. aggression in Latin America. It is a book by Claire Nito. It will be done tomorrow. We will start it tomorrow. Please join me. I'm glad you could join us. Krishna Iyer with the Iyer Think Tank in Delray Beach. Have a great day.